everybody, how we all doing?
Hello.
I'm Michael. I'm with Alex and Mason. And Alex and Mason, I got a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
If you died and became a murderous hell beast, content on not only being envious of life, but also wanting to end it, what kind of beast would you be?
You know, I've thought about this question a lot. Debated it in my own mind, gone back and forth, and ultimately, I'm going to have to say whale. I'm thinking whale.
Yeah, good old doom whale. That's good. That's good. Yeah. Mason, I know. I'm sure you've thought about this a lot too. What do you think?
Yeah, no, my first instinct was kind of like a wild boar or a pig. That just what came to my mind first.
Yeah. 1 second. I messed something up real badly.
Oh.
Ha! Did you all know it's a new audio source? Ha!
Cool.
All right. Well, we're not redoing that. Hi, I'm Michael.
Hi.
I'm with Alex and Mason.
It was a really good bit. You're just going to have to trust us.
Yeah, if you actually listen to the actual podcast when I finally post that, since we're recording the audio separately, you actually will be able to hear that really wonderful bit that we just did.
Bonus content.
Yeah, bonus
Incredible.
content. It's really great.
Value proposition.
I mean, to be fair, they actually did hear 2/3 of that because they heard y'all. They just didn't hear me.
They heard me give away the game much too early.
Indeed. But you know, hey, what can you do? What can you do? Anyways, I personally would be, by the way, a particularly stompy elephant. You know,
Elephant's
I can see
good. Boar's also good. Boar's got a good destructive charge to it.
Yes,
Yeah,
indeed.
There's through.
Yeah, you know, both of them are just real solid. So yeah, welcome to our inaugural podcast episode of Fallin Thru Plotholes, a podcast where we talk about video game franchises and the really bad storylines that underpin all of them. So this is something I've been really excited to do for a long time, although I never really thought of it as much of a viable thing until I got stuck in a cabin with my with a quarantine couple that me and the girlfriend hang out with. And I decided to tell him all about the first 4 games of Mega Man X 1 through 4, and how that just escalates to absolute nonsense. And it turns out that was something that was really fun to do, and he seemed relatively enthralled by it. So it was like, all right, yeah, sweet, let's go ahead and do this. And so that's kind of what brings us to our first episode here. I've roped both you and both Alex and Mason into this, and they are now a captive audience for the next 2 hours, which I'm sure they will not regret.
Oh. So, if I may ask real quickly,
Absolutely.
you two, have you guys played Final Fantasy X before?
Absolutely, I absolutely love Final Fantasy X.
Okay.
Absolutely love it.
I have never played Final Fantasy X or any other Final Fantasy game, so I'm looking forward to a wild ride here.
Oh boy.
Oh, fantastic! You're gonna love it. It's a story that starts out incredibly good, and then it gets just kind of more and more insane as things go on. And I'm looking forward to explaining that.
Yeah.
But first, I think I wanted to talk about a little bit why I decided to embark on this relatively niche idea, and why I think this actually has some sort of value to even share in the first place. And a lot of it comes back to the whole concept of video games as like an audiovisual media. So video game stories are, I think a lot of times they're dismissed out of hand as being absolutely useless. And to be fair, for a lot of them, they're not wrong. But I think the way that they are constructed and presented is very unique in a way that you don't really see out of any other medium. And I think a lot of that has to do with not only video games just as like a hit-driven business, but also with how video games have evolved over a certain period of time. Like, the evolution of video games has been very quick compared to, say, movies, which is... movies have had an entire century in order to develop. And,
right.
And because, like, if you look at movies like nowadays, they're actually kind of similar to video games in the sense like they're, multi-film franchises that have roadmaps attached to them that have very curated rollouts that are very well managed at this point, or at least they usually are. Mm-hmm. In most ideal circumstances, they are. But for the longest time, that really how it wasn't really like that at all. And so I think to start off with explaining this is like kind of just go over how like movies evolved, for instance. Like the evolution of movies, like I mean, you go all the way back to the early 20th century, with silent films, right? And then about 1927 or so, you get the jazz singer. You actually have talkies now, so you now have the audio element there for films in a very definitive way. Then you get to the late 30s to early 40s, you end up with color films. You get to the 60s and 70s with film industry pushing back against the Hays Code, and you have movies that are pushing extremes as far as topics that they're doing, and kind of get more of the modern movie that you would see nowadays. Mm-hmm. And you keep moving forward to the first instances of CGI with Tron in the mid 80s, and Jurassic Park and Terminator 2, all the way up into the 2000s, where you start to see superhero movies and multi-movie franchises and sprawling cinematic universes and whatnot.
Right.
So you basically had like a pretty solid point A to point B to point C evolution for films and whatnot. But one thing that like really sets it apart, that like it has in common with like television and comic books, is that this occurred over a very long period of time. And it sort of makes sense. Like movies came about during the same time when like electricity was first starting to come to the homes, right? Mm-hmm. So it would make sense that their evolution would be, not exactly speedy. Video games are very different. Video games evolved over a very quick period from what we now know as video games, from like the early bleeps and bloops of the Atari. And I think the best way to kind of explain just how quickly things evolved is by telling you a little bit about the 1980s. In 1980, 2 games came out. You have Adventure, which was a game that came out for the Atari 2600. Very blocky sort of game, but very revolutionary at the time. It was an actual, like, you had to hunt and find keys, get swords, and like advance through a castle in order to get to the end. You get attacked by dragons. But it's all presented in this incredibly blocky sort of fashion. In arcades, you ended up having Pac-Man, which I think everybody knows what Pac-Man looks like, but it was very, very influential video game at the time. A game that actually had music for one. Like a lot of Atari 2600 games barely had any music at all, if they had much in the way of sound effects in the first place. Mm-hmm. And this was kind of like the very early stages of video gaming. Like before that, you would have a machine that was dedicated to playing one game, like a Pong machine or something similar. Mm-hmm. So 3 years later, though, Atari released iRobot into arcades, which is the first fully polygonal video game. So in about 3 years, they ended up going from very simple blocky graphics to full 3D within 3 years.
Right.
And like there's nothing at all comparable to that in movies. Like movies, like I said, it took roughly about 20 years before talkies became a thing, right? Mm-hmm. It took a further 20 years before color became widespread. Whereas like video games, it gets to you finally have like a video game that looks kind of closer to what we see nowadays. I mean, a very abstract sort of version, but still, right. Fully 3D graphics within 3 years of something like Pac-Man being released. Mm-hmm. And mind you, it would take a while before these sort of graphics would get into like home consoles and whatnot. It wouldn't be until like about the early to mid 90s. But the point being is that the evolution happened very quickly.
Right.
So you combine that with another factor that also I think has a big influence, is that video games early on were a very hit-driven business. Movies, of course, were too, but they were all built around the star system. Like, what movie was Cary Grant going to be in? You're going to build a movie around that, right? Mm-hmm. There's not 7 sequels to Citizen Kane. There's not a 7th like Citizen Kane movie where he goes to fight the fascists in Spain or something.
Right.
Although that would actually be very, very out of character for the character in Citizen Kane, but considering he's based upon William Randolph Hearst. But that's not the point. The point being is that there was one bespoke movie that involved Orson Welles, and then after that he went and did other things that he wanted to do because he's Orson Welles, and so studios cater to his demands.
Right.
Obviously, you don't have stars in video games, or at least you do. The stars are the actual video game characters. And since a lot of these companies were, basically reliant on their next big hit, when they did get a hit, they would iterate on it constantly. To give you an example, Mega Man, a game that probably has the most sequels out of any video game series I can really even think of, first got released in 1987. By 1997, there had already been 8 Mega Man games. There had already been 4 Mega Man X games. There had been 5 Mega Man Game Boy games. There had been 1 Game Gear game. There were so many games, and all of these ended up contributing to the plot in some way.
Right.
So, you combine all these things together, and you combine the fact that people grew up with video games, and as they grew up, they went from being little kids to being teenagers who wanted something a little bit more serious, or what they considered to be more serious, and established video game companies wanting to make sure that they got the sales, so they continued these franchises and attempted their best to cater to these people. This is how you get things like Mega Man, where it's basically a game about construction equipment with googly eyes trying to hilariously take over the world, and then 10 years later, somehow there's storylines involving human genocide.
Right.
It's a very quick evolution from a point A to point B sort of thing, in a way that I find absolutely fascinating, and is a big reason why I kind of want to talk about these sort of things. So, we're going to be talking about quite a few video game franchises on here. A lot of them are going to be legacy franchises from the 80s. So, like I said, your Mega Mans, your Final Fantasies, your Legend of Zeldas, Contras, and so on. There are certainly going to be some more modern-day franchises we'll talk about. Like, if this goes on long enough, I would love to talk about Mass Effect at some point.
Yeah.
And talk about the absolute nonsense that is. And we're also going to be talking a little bit about the development history of these games as well, because the development really does highly influence how these games end up turning out, where their stories go. And honestly, there's no development story that really highlights this as well as Final Fantasy X, in my opinion. So yeah, I guess with that, we should maybe start talking about Final Fantasy X a little bit. So, once again, I absolutely love Final Fantasy X. I ended up getting it when it first came out and absolutely fell in love with it. I pretty much am a pretty big defender of that game, which admittedly I'm among millions of people who absolutely love this game. It's probably one of Square's most popular games of all time. I think it's pretty safe to say, critically acclaimed back in its day and whatnot.
And when again was it released?
It was released in 2001. Yeah. So, I think to tell the story of Final Fantasy X, at least to tell the developmental history of it, you sort of have to tell the story of Final Fantasy in general, or at least up to Final Fantasy VII. Now, obviously, to go through the entire Final Fantasy series itself would be a podcast into of itself. So we're not going to do that. I don't have, let's say, 100 hours right now.
Right.
But I can give you an incredibly high-level overview at the very least. So Final Fantasy itself is a series of role-playing games that originally were developed, or still are developed, by a Japanese company called Square, now Square Enix. First getting its start in my birth year of 1987 for the Famicom or Nintendo Entertainment System. The first game is interesting in that it's not particularly original. It's very clear that they were very influenced by Western RPGs such as Ultima, as well as also by Dragon Quest as well, very popular Japanese RPG series. And, well, if you look at the monster designs, you could very clearly see that they basically took the D&D 2nd edition source manual and just basically copied all those monster designs.
Yeah, pretty much.
Like in a very 80s sort of way that you just can't really get away with nowadays. Like, somebody would notice, but back then it was the 80s, so nobody cared. Nobody cared what Japan was doing.
Right.
Like, so yeah, they put this game together. I mean, it was a success for them. And in their defense, subsequent games after this would be far more original. So Final Fantasy comes out. It's a pretty good success for them. They, of course, immediately developed Final Fantasy 2, Final Fantasy 3, Final Fantasy 4. And one thing that really sets this franchise apart at first compared to other video game franchises is the way its story is handled. Each story is bespoke upon each game. It's Final Fantasy does not have a continuous story of, like, say, Final Fantasy 2. Final Fantasy 3 is not a story sequel to Final Fantasy 2. Each game has a distinct set of characters, a distinct enemy, and like distinct settings to a certain extent. Now, they definitely have commonalities between them or whatnot. They generally include, like, a medieval European setting, very Lord of the Rings-ish. Usually there would be, like, some sort of 4 elemental crystals. And for one reason or another, almost always an ancient, fallen, technologically advanced society and evil empires. Like, they love themselves their Star Wars and evil empires, and they also love the robots, and they want to make sure that you can fight a robot with a sword at some point. Like, even going back to, like, the first game, it's like, oh yeah, okay, there's just mechs now, I guess. All right, cool.
Yeah, sure.
So someone not familiar with this franchise, are they all set in the same universe, or is that different too?
Not at all. They're not even set in the same universe.
There is technically possibly a low-level multiverse thing going on, but for the most part, they don't talk about that.
Yeah. And that was more just to set up a fighting game.
Yeah. Or an MMORPG.
Or a card game.
Or, yeah.
Whatever Square Enix wants to sell, say, past 2005.
Right. So there are, like, hints that they could pull on to pull everything into some giant thing if they wanted to, but in general, their stories are completely separate in separate universes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like, you would at best get a wink and a nod, and that's it. Now, this wasn't necessarily a unique thing to Final Fantasy. Dragon Quest, and once again, another Japanese RPG that's kind of like the really, really big game over there, also sort of did this. They have more overt references to each other, but they're also pretty distinct from one another. But Final Fantasy, at least compared to most other video game franchises, was pretty big about keeping things separate. So with each new game being released, Final Fantasy did get slowly more and more popular. However, through the release of Final Fantasy VI in 1994, the series itself wasn't as successful as it seemingly could be. Like, these games were critically acclaimed. They would often be on, like, different video game magazines like Top 10 End of the Year lists. But one reason or another, these just weren't that popular. Now, in Japan, it sort of made sense because they played second banana to Dragon Quest. A RPG that literally was so successful and so popular that, one, it inspired a popular myth that the Japanese government mandated that new games could only be released on the weekend, which itself wasn't actually true, but it still wormed its way into people's minds that was actually true.
I believed that for a while.
Yeah, I did too. I was sad it got debunked, actually.
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
And over in the Western world, it was just second to everything else. And a big reason is because RPGs simply didn't have the same popularity as sports or platforming video games, and were often considered a nerdy subculture, what was already a very nerdy subculture when it came to video games. So, needless to say, like they definitely were getting more and more popular. Square definitely was having success in the United States. Like, they had a U.S. office in the early to mid-90s, but it seemed like they were just far away from the real success that you would figure they would have. This all changed with the release of Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation in 1997. If we ever talk about other, like, Final Fantasy extended universes, you're going to find that basically all roads lead to Final Fantasy VII in one way or another, and really for good reason. Now, it would be very easy to talk about why Final Fantasy VII is so important for, like, hours, but once again, I'm going to keep this short. Due to a combination of revolutionary CGI graphics, a huge scope in terms of gameplay and world, a new modern setting, like 1960s, 1970s modern setting, and characters people found very engaging, this game sold incredibly well. This was like a really weird game where people just already knew it was going to be successful before it even came out. Mm-hmm. Like, Sony actually contributed $20 million for an ad campaign in North America because they were so bullish that this game was going to be successful and just needed to be advertised that they're like, yeah, no, we're going to throw money at this. We're going to help you out because we know this is going to sell systems. And they were 100% right. Mm-hmm. In Japan, the game sold 2.3 million copies within the first 3 days. And by the end of... Yeah, right? And by the end of 2003, total worldwide sales were 9.3 million. So if you compare that with Final Fantasy VI, the last game, which was released late in the Super Nintendo's life cycle on a console that was in much more, like a larger amount of homes, that shipped 3.4 million copies by the end of 2003. Not even sold, it just shipped 3.4 million copies. Wow. That's how big of a success Final Fantasy VII was. Mm-hmm. It still wasn't technically the top RPG in Japan. Dragon Quest still was outselling it, but it was a top RPG everywhere else. And I believe it was one of, if not the top selling game in the United States in 1997. So it kind of didn't matter that they weren't top dog in Japan.
Right.
They were on top everywhere else. So here's the problem with that, though. The problem with this success is that they need to make a Final Fantasy VIII.
Right.
And once again, Square doesn't make direct sequels to Final Fantasy games. And they weren't going to start now. Mm-hmm. Now, they are going to take some lessons from Final Fantasy VII. And many common elements are going to be carried over. So they're going to keep, for instance, the modern setting. Like, in fact, they're going to make it even more modern. You can rent cars and whatnot, and you have a job. Mm-hmm. You literally get paychecks in the game. It's really weird. The main character was also a brooding stoic man who was named after a type of weather. In Final Fantasy VII, that was Cloud Strife. In Final Fantasy VIII, that's Squall Leonhardt. They also carried giant swords, whereas Cloud had the Buster Sword, Squall had the Gunblade. People really enjoyed the love story that was in Final Fantasy VII, so Final Fantasy VIII doubled down on it and made it a central theme of the game. Summon animations, which were like kind of like more of an afterthought in Final Fantasy VII, but people really enjoyed it. The spectacle of them became a central plot point in Final Fantasy VIII. Mm-hmm. And in general, they just threw a bunch of money at this and just kind of doubled down on like the success of Final Fantasy.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
I have gone through a lot of emotions in my life about Final Fantasy VIII.
Me too.
I think I've landed on, God, this game's so stupid, but I really appreciate it.
It is a game where they really went for it in many ways.
They really did. It is earnest. No one can say it's not earnest.
Yeah, like, while they did definitely, like, took lessons from Final Fantasy VII and double down on some elements, it is definitely its own thing. It is 100% its own thing.
Yes, I would never... Other than, like, this and that element, I would never accuse it of being an FF7 clone. No. It is definitely trying to follow up that success, but also in its own way.
Yeah, it definitely is. It definitely is. I am nowadays a Final Fantasy VIII defender, very quietly, very meekly. Mm-hmm. And usually it's more in the way of, listen, you can play cards and break the game. My God, you could break the game. You could be level 7 and just beat it.
Yeah. Yeah, that too.
Yeah, which is actually probably not in favor of the game, but you know. So Final Fantasy VIII was released to critical acclaim, and it did sell very well. However, fan reaction was a bit more mixed. Mm. While most did overall like the game, they were disappointed in the fact that really they just weren't playing as their favorite characters from the previous game. And I honestly was one of them. Like, I got Final Fantasy VII when it first came out. I got Final Fantasy VIII when it first came out. And I was like, this is not Cloud.
Right.
Like, it wasn't what I wanted. And, like, Square had obviously been doing this for 8 years. But now that it's, big in North America and, like, people, there's a lot of eyeballs on it. People just were not used to this idea of, like, oh, there's a sequel, but...
Right. Well, especially in the 90s in America, when going back to movies, we'd gone through your Die Hards, your Lethal Weapons, your, what have you, of just endless franchises. Mm.
Yeah, just like the movie franchise was starting to really become a big thing around now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it totally makes sense. And like, you look at like Super Mario Brothers or other video game franchises, and yeah, there's an expectation if you do another game in this series, you're going to be playing as your favorite characters, but that just was not the case.
Right. I mean, I feel like I hesitate to call it series, but the Batman movies raised some eyebrows when it changed actors after, one or two movies, and people were like, well, wait, is this a direct sequel to the last one? And the answer was sort of nebulous.
Yeah, it was kind of, if you squint.
Yeah. But that's still the same character.
Yeah.
And that was enough to make people raise their eyebrows. So yeah, completely different universe, characters, mechanics, history, everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And yeah, like... Yeah, and like, it would have been maybe okay if, like, people, like, related to the main character and, like, really liked the love story, but a lot of people, at least, my age, which admittedly we were dumb 12-year-olds,
right?
We're like, Squall sucks, this main character sucks, this love story, like, what's going on with it? I still don't... I've come around on the love story in Final Fantasy VIII, but it's still,
not great.
It's not great. And while this game was a financial success, it did ultimately sell something like 8 million copies. It was clear Square had to go back to the drawing board.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Final Fantasy IX is its own sort of thing, so we're not going to really talk about that. It was kind of meant to be like a celebration of Final Fantasy as a whole.
Yeah.
And a lot of their efforts were going to be towards Final Fantasy X, which was going to debut on Sony's new console, the PlayStation 2, 2001. Right. Developers involved in this game, which included producer Yoshinori Kitase and character designer Tetsuya Nomura, really big, influential figures at Square at the time, and still are, could have doubled down on Final Fantasy VII again. But they, and admittedly this is in my opinion, wisely chose not to.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, they decided to go with a fantasy setting again, but not like a medieval European fantasy setting. This time they based it around South Pacific cultures, using Thailand, Okinawa, Siam, other countries, and other locales as the basis for this game. Scenario writers Daisuke Watabe teamed up with Kazushige Nojima, which put a pin in that name. Put a pin in Nojima's name, because we are going to be coming back to this guy. They teamed up to write this game, write the scenario for it, and kind of do the world building. The idea was to focus on a main character who entered a strange and unusual world and kind of reacted to a very, very strange society that he's in. Mm-hmm. Now, the game's development contained firsts for the series, including being mostly fully polygonal for the first time in the series, and including a ton of voice acting, which just hadn't really been in Final Fantasy before then.
Right.
It also skewed a lot of established concepts, including the battle system, which had been in place essentially for 6 games up to that point, 5 or 6 games, and also like got rid of like the world map and like made it like a more linear sort of experience. In many ways, this game was a huge gamble for Square as they moved the series in a new direction. Now, this game was always expected to do well, but owing to the fact that it was released on the still new PlayStation 2, a console that I think was less than a year old in Japan by the time this game came out, the game was only expected to initially sell 2 million titles worldwide.
Mm.
However, upon its release in 2001, that expectation was completely shattered. The game, in the first 4 days in Japan, sold 1.4 million copies.
Wow.
By the end of 2004, the game had sold 6.6 million copies worldwide. So
I'm honestly surprised expectations were that low, because I remember the hype leading up to this game was exceptional.
Oh yeah, I remember it too, but I think a lot of it wasn't so much like this game isn't going to be a success, but it's like there's not a whole lot of PlayStation 2 consoles out there.
Right. Fair. Yep.
And like it sort of makes sense. It's kind of like releasing a game like PlayStation 2. I think people forget about this. It was really hard to get for a long time. Very similar to how the PlayStation 5 was difficult to find now.
Yeah. PlayStation release cycles.
Yeah, pretty much. Unless you wanted to get that PlayStation 4, in which case you had no trouble. But, like, the game was critically acclaimed, and fans seemed to love this game, including myself, and it's still remembered very fondly to this day. Now, This game came and went, and with Final Fantasy XI, Square would continue their tradition of each game being its own bespoke thing. That being said, by this point, they've learned their lesson from Final Fantasy VIII, and they're not going to let a popular game go to waste. 2 years later, they would release their first direct Final Fantasy game, a video game sequel, in the form of Final Fantasy X-2, which I am a defender of.
Why?
I will get to that eventually. Because first we have to talk about the plot of Final Fantasy X.
Okay.
Is it literally called Final Fantasy X too?
Yes, it's
specifically X-2.
Yeah. Their naming conventions are... Well, Square's naming conventions are incredibly bad. Let me tell you about the fabulous Novus Crystallis. But...
Oh, boy, I can't wait for that episode.
Oh, I can't wait either. But yeah, I am a defender of Final Fantasy X too, but I'm not a defender of anything that comes after that, let me assure you. But we're going to get to that maybe today, possibly next time. But first, I think we need to talk about a little game called Final Fantasy X.
So I do, if I may, I wanted to bring up, sort of tie the whole summary of Final Fantasy back into something you made a point about earlier, or at the beginning, which was that part of the reason video game stories are so absurd is that they're often overlooked.
Yes.
And a big part of that has to do with the evolution of video games. And when you were demonstrating that, specifically you focused on the way that the graphics of video games improved and the way that the technology of video games improved.
Yes.
And that because video games are a digital art form, the technology behind them is a major driving force of what they are.
Yeah.
And because they're interactive, in most cases, that results in the technology being a driving force in what the gameplay is, how you play the game, what's possible. Yeah. So, you play Metal Gear Solid and, we have these new lighting effects, quote unquote, and we have 3D models and cameras. You can look around corners and, all this stuff. So often the technology drives the video game and the story is a secondary concern to justify it to anyone who's curious or whatever, I guess.
Oh yeah, totally. Like in the mid 80s, a lot of games would just be written into a manual to justify whatever thin premise they had going on, right?
Right. But because of what Final Fantasy is, and because of what it started out as being, Final Fantasy's story has sort of always been central to its identity.
Yeah.
And so the technology of Final Fantasy games has necessarily been used to drive storytelling.
I would agree with this, yes.
And so that is an interestingly unique factor to RPGs in general and Final Fantasy in particular. And balancing that has been one of the main things that's gotten Square Enix into trouble a lot of times. I don't know if you were going to talk about, Final Fantasy X came at a time when Square Enix was, or not Square Enix, Squaresoft still at this point, was in a lot of economic trouble because they made some gambles on this, on stuff they were working on, and it didn't pay off.
Yeah, I wasn't going to bring that up, but you're not wrong. Yeah, because this is roughly around the time of Final Fantasy, The Spirits Within, and other sort of high-profile projects that just kind of didn't work out in a way that they really should have.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go
ahead. But contrasted to Final Fantasy VII, which is another case where they took new technology and put it towards storytelling. So it's not just that, look at these cutscenes, they're really pretty. It's that the cutscenes helped establish the world of Midgar and Terra, I want to say.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, it helped establish what was going on in that game.
Terra or Gaia, I think it was Gaia. But yeah, it created this sort of vibrancy and livingness to the world that let people really believe it and inhabit it. Mm-hmm. And so I find it interesting that Final Fantasy, like most games, is driven by technology, but it's driven in a way that is sort of unique to it. And I think Final Fantasy X also had that sort of driving force behind it.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you there. A lot of the decisions they made with like the 3D modeling, the voice acting, and all that were in service of the story rather than in service of the gameplay. In many ways, yeah. And yeah, that is quite unique to it compared to other video games of the era. But yeah, I think we should talk about that game just a little bit.
Yes, let's do that.
Let's do that. So, I'm really excited to tell you about this, Mason, because the first game, in my opinion, has a very, very good story. And then it just gets kind of nuts from there. But even like from the very beginning, Final Fantasy X has its own interesting ideas kind of going on in it, just like from the get-go. Mm-hmm. So to start with, Final Fantasy X takes place in a world called Spira. Spira is I would say it is an oversized island chain archipelago, if you wish, that really has like the ocean being like a kind of like a central theme to it. Because once again, the whole idea is this was supposed to like harken back to like South Pacific cultures and whatnot. So even like with the exception of like the tallest mountain, you're never far away from the ocean in this world. You're basically either on islands or on oversized islands, more or less.
And sorry, if I can interrupt one more time, I wanted to say I really love that they did that. Mm-hmm. Because it shows, I think they realized that, you know, one of the things people really were drawn to about Final Fantasy VII wasn't just it was the, oh, look, this cool diesel punk world. It's that there hadn't been an RPG in a diesel punk world like that before.
Yeah.
It's not just that the setting was cool, it's that it was unique to JRPGs. Mm-hmm. And the idea of doing like a diesel punk anti-authoritarian story like that in the framework and trappings of a traditional Final Fantasy was like cool.
Yeah. Yeah, it totally was. And it's also the reason why Final Fantasy VIII didn't hit as hard, right? Because it's like, wait, you already did that.
Yeah.
And then, you get Final Fantasy X, you get this more, Southeastern cultural flavor or whatnot. And, all of a sudden it's fresh again.
Yeah.
So, this game starts out with... Well, first off, it starts out with the main character overlooking a hill over onto a destroyed city. And he asks you to, listen to his story. And that this may be his last chance. And he's surrounded by a bunch of people who are just looking incredibly, incredibly somber. And you're like, seems like some bad things are going on. There's some soulful music playing. And things are looking pretty rough. So this immediately smash cuts to a vibrant city at night surrounded by water. And we find out this city is called Zanarkand. Zanarkand is, think of like Singapore if it's perpetually at night, perpetually lit up, and every skyscraper has a waterfall coming out of it. Like, it seems like a really rad place. And we start out on this boat, and there is this young boy who is surrounded by a bunch of fans. And we learn that this boy's name is Tidus. Tidus is a star sports player, specifically a star player of the Zanarkand Abes, a blitzball team. Blitzball being a really silly sport that is more or less a cross between underwater polo and soccer. And it's played in like this giant sphere of water that's created by a machine in a stadium. Anyways, he's, surrounded by fans and whatnot. And, he's like, signing autographs, but, he has to leave and go and play in this blitzball game. And it turns out it's the final in this blitzball tournament that's in celebration of his father, Jecht, who unfortunately went missing 10 years ago. We also find that Tidus hates his dad. Like, he looks up and is just like, this mother. Like, he just has like a look on his face like he's absolutely disgusted. And we learn why later. It turns out that, Jecht was a very pompous sort of guy, very, like, full of himself, an alcoholic, and also just sort of emotionally abusive to Tidus, like, completely.
He was also a famous athlete.
He was also a famous athlete. Yep. Yeah, he was also a star blitzball player. Yeah, his big things are to say in a gravelly voice, like, "Oh, you're gonna cry, and I'm the best." And so he's going to playing this in this game and whatnot, and like a really cool cutscene plays where he's playing Blitzball and whatnot, and like really awful rock song is playing that is technically has lyrics and technically is on a soundtrack. So I'm not sure if I can actually play it, but
don't know.
It's one of those things that I have no copyright strikes, so we're going to try to keep it that way.
Yeah, anyone can just go look up Another World. You'll find it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just look up opening cutscene Final Fantasy X and be amazed as you see a giant sphere of water rise out of the ocean and then somehow start attacking the city of Zanarkand, including the Blitzball Stadium that Tidus is playing in. So this giant body of water floats out, destroys quite a bit of the city, including the Blitzball Stadium, and Tidus ends up getting knocked out and somehow escaping with his life. Now, he comes to and he runs out of the stadium. Everyone's kind of going crazy. And he runs into this older man who is maybe the greatest RPG character to ever be created.
Quite possibly.
His name is Auron. And Auron is, for those of you who are listening to this later, he is an older man with like kind of like short spiky hair, graying at the temples and whatnot. Got glasses on, is missing an eye, has a bum arm, and looks like has like this nice red robe on with a giant jug of what I presume is just the hardest whiskey on his side, or sake. Mm. And like Tidus clearly knows Auron. He's like, "Hey, what's going on?" And Auron's just like super chill. He's like, I was just waiting for you. Anyways, we need to go. And so they start immediately running towards the giant, ball of water, which Tidus is not cool with. But Auron tells them, "Hey, no, we have to do this." Also, that thing's name is Sin. You're gonna find that Final Fantasy X is very on the nose with a lot of things.
Yeah, subtlety's never been their strong point or their interest.
No, and to be fair, with the amount of things I missed the first time playing through this game, they kind of had to be. So, yeah. So they immediately start running towards Sin. They're fighting through a bunch of monsters that Sin is releasing called Sin Spawn. And eventually they do reach Sin. Like a big explosion happens and like Tidus is like hanging on the side of like a railing and whatnot. And Auron actually looks up and like acknowledges Sin. Is like, "Hey, you sure you want me to do this?" And like even in an earlier cutscene, we can see that Auron seems to know what Sin's deal is right away. Like he seems to be like welcome to the city when he rises out of the water. But after he asks, Sin if he's sure, he grabs Tidus by his shirt and then just throws him into Sin. And Tidus gets knocked out. He ends up in like a bit of a dream world that's like kind of represents Zanarkand. And like kind of swims to what looks like his father before passing out again and waking up in a bunch of ruins with his face more or less down in the water. So Tidus is now like completely disoriented. He has no idea where he is. He's definitely not in Zanarkand anymore. He gets chased by a bunch of monsters, ends up getting trapped in this temple, and is like half starving, cold, and just basically is on the verge of death when he's attacked by some more monsters. Luckily for him, though, a bunch of people just like bust through the wall. They blow a hole into the temple and whatnot, and in walk these 5 figures. All of them blonde, all of them have green eyes, and they're accompanied by this young woman who clearly seems like she's in charge. She helps Tidus fight off the monsters and whatnot, and Tidus is like super happy that she helped him out. Unfortunately for him, they don't speak his language. 2, they have guns and immediately point them at him, and then the young girl proceeds to punch him and knock him out. Tidus, for the first half of the game, likes to travel around not by boat or by airship or by any other means than traumatic stupor, because this is not going to be the first time he's going to get knocked out and end up somewhere else. He at least got like 3 more times before he finally settles on, maybe I should just walk somewhere.
Yeah.
So he wakes up on this looks like a fishing trawler and whatnot. And these 5 blonde figures once again walk out and, pantomime what they want him to do. And he just has no understanding of what's going on. Thankfully, though, the girl actually speaks his language and says, hey, work for us. You can go ahead and live, and you can live with us. And so he's pretty stoked about that, mostly because otherwise they would shoot him. So he helps him out for a little bit. He ends up getting fed food, and this girl starts to bond with him. And we find out this girl's name is Riku. Riku is a 15-year-old girl. Titus, for reference, is 17. And we find out that she is a member of a race of people called the Albed. The Albed are basically like the Roma people, more or less, of this universe. They're wandering travelers. They're kind of hated by everyone else. And they're hated because they really are okay with the idea of using what's called a machina. Or as they say it, machines called machina. Raises the question why they don't just call it machines, but
Boy, I did forget about that.
Yeah. So they're talking a little bit, and she's like, hey, where are you from? He's like, oh, don't you know? Oh, I'm from Xanarkand. I'm the star player of the Xanarkand Abes. And so she just, gets quiet and is like, hey, Xanarkand hasn't existed for 1,000 years, right? It was destroyed by sin 1,000 years ago. And so he's like, oh, shoot, did I travel through time? What happened? And so she says, oh, well, you must have been infected by Sin's toxin. So people get close to Sin apparently get amnesia or get false memories. And so she reasons that, well, that must have been what happened. And she also notices that he just seems to not remember a whole lot of things either, just in general. She talks about him about, Yevon, which is the main religion of the Spira, and he has no idea what that is. And she gets frustrated with him very quickly, but she's like, hey, how about this? I'll take you to Luca, which is a big city where people play blitzball. There are blitzball players there. You're going to find somebody you know there. And he's like, rad. This sounds great. Unfortunately, and he thinks in his head, it's like, all right, I also think if I can find Sin, I bet you I can get back home. Which, luckily for him, or maybe unluckily for him, Sin then just all of a sudden just shows up, attacks the ship, and pulls Titus overboard. He ends up getting sucked into a whirlpool and ends up getting knocked out. So you would think that this would cause Titus to drown and the game would be over. And given that he wakes up with his face down in the water in a tropical paradise with, cerulean, seas and, beautiful jungle background, you would think he would be dead. But it turns out people don't drown in Final Fantasy X?
It's unclear.
Apparently, they can use spirit energy to keep them from drowning. But it's very silly. It's very silly. Either way, Titus wakes up, he gets hit in the head with the blitzball, and he's super excited about that. Literally. Because he sees a bunch of figures on the beach, and they're like, hey, can you give us our blitzball back? And so he does a cool blitzball move, and all of a sudden, they are super impressed with him. And, he goes up to these people and like, hey, man, that's really cool. We're a blitzball team. That is so rad. What's your name, man? And Titus is like, oh, I'm the star player of the Xanarkand Abes. And they're like, we didn't ask that. And also, what did you say? They get incredibly stone quiet and just stare at him at the death stare. And he's like, oh, I was near Sin and my head got foggy And they're like, oh, you're close to Sin, but you lived. Praise be to Yevon. And Titus, once again, is a little confused about what Yevon is. And this is where we meet our first party member. And his name is Wakka. Wakka is a cool dude. As you can see, he's like a Polynesian-looking man. Tall, pretty well built, has a hell of a red cowlick. He is, the best to describe his personality is that he is a Texan. And by that, I mean he's from Central Texas, San Angelo. And the reason why I say this as a fellow Texan, Texans are the friendliest people you will ever meet. They'll be incredibly helpful to you if you're their neighbor. They will do anything for you that's within reason. They'll invite you over to watch football until you do one of two things. You insult the Dallas Cowboys, or you either are not Christian or say something bad about Christianity. And then you need to move away because you're not welcome there anymore. Wakka is the captain of the Besaid Aurochs, brother. And he loves blitzball. And he is a devout follower of the Yevon religion, and he does not gel well with people who do not follow the religion. So, needless to say, Tidus mentioned that he's from a place that is apparently revered in the Yevon religion and has been destroyed 1,000 years ago. Did not really sit well with Wakka, but Tidus made a good recovery there. And so Wakka like immediately takes a shine to Tidus and is like, hey, first off, can you join our blitzball team? We really suck. We haven't won in 10 years. Which is true. And Tidus agrees. And two, he's like, hey, how about I take you to the town of Besaid? You're on Besaid Island, and, I'll get you fed, you can rest, and we'll figure something out, man. And so, yeah, they go and they travel to the main village, and you can clearly tell that, like, Wakka is like a big brother figure and whatnot to everybody he meets. So, they end up getting to the town, and, Tidus rests for a little bit, but we hear that a woman is having trouble in the temple, and she's been in there for a long time. And so Tidus overhears this, and he runs down to the temple. He's like, okay, well, what's going on here? And we learn that somebody is in the temple praying in the Chamber of the Faith. And we learn that if somebody is praying in the Chamber of the Faith, you cannot go in. So Tidus is concerned. He's like, hey, is this dangerous to do that? And Wakka's like, yeah, sometimes it is. And so Tidus is like, well, screw that. I'm going in there. I got to help her. And Wakka and the priest of the temple try to stop him. And they're like, hey, you are committing blasphemy. What are you doing? And he's like, I don't care. And so he runs in there. This is like one of the few times that Wakka's kind of cool with blasphemy. Because he like runs after him and he's like, don't worry about it. It's sin's toxins, right? You're just a crazy kid. And so they end up getting to the Chamber of the Faith and whatnot. And they run into two other people who we're unfortunately not going to really talk about a whole lot, but I'll put their pictures up anyways. And it's these two fun people. We got there's a woman who is dressed in all black everything, a black fur coat with a skirt made out of black belts, whose name is Lulu, and then a cat man whose name is Kamari. We're unfortunately not going to be talking a whole lot about them. They actually don't. They have their own separate story arcs, but for the purposes of getting through this, they don't really contribute a whole lot to what's
Final
going
Fantasy
on.
X doesn't talk about them that much either.
No.
Lulu at least gets screen time, but not in any particularly meaningful way.
Yeah.
Kamari...
Kamari's big deal is that Kamari is a cat man who is short.
Yep.
And he has short man syndrome, literally.
Yep.
And his big thing is he wants to prove himself to his race of catmen who are called the Ronzo, who we'll be talking more about later.
Kamari sort of continues from Final Fantasy IX, Freya's proud tradition of, look at that person, look at that animal dragoon person. Wow, that person's really cool. What's their deal?
Yeah. It's like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had a cat person? And it's like, should we do anything with them?
You can get sad about stuff, I guess.
Yeah, that's pretty much the existence of the Ronzos too. Boy, that was sad, and we'll talk about what they're being sad about later. Lulu's big thing is that, like, if Wakka is the big brother, Lulu is the kind of mean big sister to everybody.
Yes.
That's kind of her deal. We'll chime in with her a little bit more as it goes on, but like I said, unfortunately, there's really 3 or 4 characters that Final Fantasy X really focuses on, and unfortunately, these two aren't that. But they're there apparently with whoever is praying in the Chamber of Faith, and it turns out, like, they see Tidus and like, what are you doing here? And right before Tidus can answer, the door opens, and this woman walks out who's roughly about Tidus's age. And she collapses, but recovers quickly, gets up and says, I've done it. I finally have become a summoner. And she's really excited about it. And so everybody goes outside, and all the residents of Besaid are super excited about this. Like, hey, there's a new summoner. And so Tidus is really confused, but Wakka's like, hey, just hang out here, just check this out. And, Yuna does a little twirl with her staff, and this giant bird monster just flies down right next to her. And everybody's like super impressed. And so it's like, oh, okay, summoner. She summons creatures. Makes sense. The summoners do a little bit more than that. And we'll talk about what else they do here in a bit. But for now, what we just need to know is that they are able to summon monsters. And that's apparently a very big deal. So there's a huge celebration that is held in the evening. And, Tidus and Yuna are basically locking eyes and are being very flirty. And, walking to the point is like, hey, don't get any ideas. That's like my little sister, man. What are you doing? And all the residents are all upset at Tidus in the first place for the whole thing about committing blasphemy earlier. They're not particularly happy about that, but Yuna invites him over and starts talking to him. And it turns out they have a lot in common. It turns out they both have famous fathers. It turns out Yuna's father, Braska, was the last high summoner, of which there's only been 4 in the entire history of Spira. And there's a lot of expectations that she's going to be a great summoner as well, which Tidus obviously emphasizes with because his father was a famous blitzball player. And everybody expected he was going to be a great blitzball player. So they talk for a while and whatnot, and she mentions hey, we're going to be traveling to Luca. We're going to be on the same boat. We should definitely talk more later. And he's like, rad. So, to describe Yuna a little bit more detail, Yuna is a character who's very quiet and very reserved. But she generally really, really wants to help people at pretty much no matter what cost. That's probably one of the big things that she really does share with Tidus. Tidus is kind of the same way. He's if somebody's in danger, he doesn't care if he has to, invalidate a religion's beliefs or murder a man. He's gonna do it. Yuna is kind of the same way, except she'll think 5 minutes at least before she does it. She actually observes situations, whereas Tidus he leads with his head, which is why he's probably constantly getting knocked out. But
yes,
but yeah, they all get together. Tidus, Waka, Lulu, Kimari, Yuna, and they all go down to the port of Besaid, get on the ship, and they start traveling to Kalika, which is going to be their first stop on the way to Luca. So this is where we kind of find out a little bit about what Yuna's up to. So Yuna is a summoner, and a summoner, they go on what's called a pilgrimage. They're very important in the Yevon religion, and the whole idea behind their pilgrimage is they are trying to go to the different temples, pray at their chambers of the faith, and learn their various summons called aeons. The whole idea is to prove that they can control aeons so they can get what's called the final summon. And the final summon is apparently the way to defeat Sin and bring about the calm. The calm being a period of time where Sin just doesn't exist and society can rebuild. Because during this time, Sin is going around to every big city and basically laying waste to it. If there's any city that has a large amount of machina or has built up at all, Sin just kind of shows up and destroys it, and nobody can do a thing about it. Now, there's a lot of speculation as to why Sin even exists, but the whole point of the Yevon religion is this idea that people were being decadent 1,000 years ago. They got lazy because of machina. They were using machina to, help light their homes or build their cities or just make their life easier, and that made them soft. And so Sin showed up in order to show them their hubris and destroy humanity and bring them back to a more natural sort of state, be more in tune with nature. Because the idea of that, machina are sort of an affront to nature. There's a lot of nature versus science in this game, which is a kind of common with a couple of Final Fantasy games in that regard. And the idea is that Sin will go away if everybody gives up machina and just learns to just treat each other right and work with our common men. This is also why the Albed are really hated, because Albed are just we're just going to use machina because we should use machina to help people. And so all the Yevonites are you are just making Sin exist, and thus you need to be destroyed. So, go ahead.
So, I do, you mentioned that nature versus machines is sort of common in a lot of Final Fantasies, and one of those obviously being Final Fantasy VII again. Yeah. And I like that in FF7, the whole stance of the game was very much nature good, technology if not always bad, tend to cause problems for nature.
Yeah.
And so, we need to be very proactive of protecting nature, which was, a big part of that game's message. And I think it was a very well done message.
Yeah.
But I like that this game, again, not settling into FF7's shadow is very, very early on is like, well, maybe it's not that clear cut. Like maybe the hard line return to nature isn't as everything it's cracked up to be.
Yeah, this game goes more for a coexistence of nature and science. Yeah. Not to get too ahead of ourselves, but yeah, there's definitely going to be instances where it's like, oh, okay, maybe machinery actually isn't a bad thing.
Yeah. But I also like that it introduces you to the Albed first, so that when when the other people are like, oh, the Albed are evil, they're causing sin, you're like, I don't know, I talked to those guys, they seemed alright.
Yeah, they gave me food. I mean, they didn't
give me pointed guns at me, but I mean, I get that.
I mean, I wish they would have given me a fork so I could eat my food, but yeah, whatever, I was wearing these gloves.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, it is a smart choice to make sure you meet an Albed first before they just go like, Albed are evil, and set you up for that obvious twist of like, oh, maybe they aren't so bad after all. Like, they lay that card out on the table very early.
Yeah.
So, as they're traveling on the boat, Tidus, talks with Yuna some more, and this is where we find one of our first big twists, which is that Yuna mentions that, like, she wants to follow in her steps of her father, Braska, who, became a high summoner and whatnot, and, she was really proud of, like, the Guardians who followed along with her. Guardians being people who guard the summoner, because the pilgrimage is a very, very dangerous thing. And she mentions that one of the Guardians was a man by the name of Jecht. And so Tidus is like, oh, wait, my dad's name was Jecht. And then Yuna just makes the immediate jump to being like, oh, you must be his son. Which is, I guess Jecht is just not a common name at all. So, yeah, sure, okay.
I mean, yeah, it's kind of not.
And Jecht was, I mean, not Jecht, Tidus is like, well, this doesn't match up, though. You're talking about my father as if he was some sort of good guy who was good with kids. Because she talked about, I was like, oh, yeah, Jecht would play with me when I was a kid. It was great. And he's like, he just always called me a crybaby a lot and said I couldn't do enough push-ups. This does not line up at all. But it establishes very on that Yuna kind of believes everything Tidus says. Like, when Tidus is like, hey, I'm from Xanarchy. And she's like, oh, are you? Man, I can't wait to go back there with you. Whereas everyone else is like, doesn't believe a word Tidus is saying, just thinks Sin's toxin. So, during this time, Sin shows up yet again. It seems like Sin is like falling around Tidus or something like that, or either that, Tidus just has a absolute worse luck. And like, they realize that he's going towards Kilika. And so, like, the ship tries to stop them, but obviously if they haven't been able to stop Sin for 1,000 years, what's going to stop it? What's a little ship going to do to stop him now? And Sin gets away and completely devastates the port of Kilika, killing an untold amount. And this is where we get to the other job of a summoner. So Yuna arrives at the port and immediately is like, they find out the summoner's there and they're like, hey, we need you to perform the sending. We need you to do this before things get really bad here. And she, of course, readily agrees. And it's a very famous cutscene, or at least famous in terms of like video game stories and whatnot, of Yuna performing this elaborate dance in order to make what appears to be souls to rise out of everyone's body. And so this is what we get to, this is where we learn about the true nature of a summoner. So a summoner's whole deal is that they can control spiritual energy. So people who may have seen the subtitle of this episode, Dying Sucks, but I think it's something like Dying Sucks unless you really don't want to. It turns out death is a weirdly fungible thing in this universe. So when a person dies, they have a spirit that is manifested in what's called pyroflies. They're like basically like little orbs of light and whatnot. Now, if a person has regrets about life and a summoning is ascending isn't performed for them, their soul stays bound to this plane, and they will become envious of life and then later resentful. And when they become resentful, they can form into monsters called fiends. And fiends are little monsters that are just all around the world that the characters are fighting throughout the game. Now, if a person performs ascending, their soul becomes calm and it goes to the far plane or just to spirit heaven in general or what have you. So, summoners are able to control this energy, and that's how they are able to summon. They basically summon these aeons by basically getting a bunch of fireflies together in the form of an aeon, and that's how that appears. So they're very in tune with nature. They're very in tune with souls in general. And they serve a very important religious function in the Church of Yevon, which is also why they're revered. Not only for their ability to defeat sin, but for their ability to make there be less crazy monsters all over the place. So, go ahead.
So I do want to, give another shout out to this cutscene. If anyone hasn't seen it, I highly recommend looking it up. It's very well directed. It's very well cinematographed. Mm-hmm. It's just a well done visual piece in general. But it also goes back to what I mentioned earlier about Final Fantasy uses technology to push storytelling.
Yeah.
And one of the things that this cutscene, sort of above maybe everything else in the game, did for me is the power of being able to see this as this beautifully realized pre-rendered cutscene sort of drove home the emotional impact of this scene. And the reason that's relevant is that Titus is very much old habit. Titus is very much a fish out of water in this story. And up until now, his connection to all the other characters is sort of tenuous. Like, he is alongside them by circumstance.
Yeah.
But that's sort of it. He doesn't have a reason to invest in them or their journey or anything.
Yeah.
And he has no personal motivation to latch onto this event. But being able to feel how powerful this moment is helps you understand why he makes the decisions that he does coming up.
Yeah, he's not he's invested in the group in the sense of like, oh, they seem like nice people, I guess. But like after this, he's like, oh, yeah, no, I can see why they want to defeat sin. This is absolutely awful. I should figure out a way to help out. Yeah, he becomes pretty much 100%, maybe not 100%, but pretty darn invested after this.
Yeah, much more so than he has been to this point.
Mm-hmm. So, Kilika happens to have a temple, so they go and pray there, and Yuna ends up getting another Aeon. This time it's a fire dog. It's really great.
Yeah.
And they end up getting back on the ship, and they travel to Luca. So, Luca is where a big blitzball tournament is going to be held, and this tournament's held once a year, and the Besaid Aurochs really want to win this time, and they have the seer weapon in Tidus. And so the idea is that they're going to go, like, Waka wants to perform in this blitzball tournament, hopefully win it, and then retire and become Yuna's guardian right afterwards and help her on her journey. So they get off on the ship right at the same time that a couple of heads of the Yevon religion also get off of this boat. One of them that we're not going to talk about a whole lot is Maester Micah, who is the head of the Yevon religion, which might seem a little odd that we're not going to talk a whole lot about him. He's basically just a generic old man in many ways. But we are going to talk about this guy.
Mm-hmm.
Mason, you don't know anything about Final Fantasy X. Looking at this guy, what do you think his deal is?
I don't know. It definitely seems like an enemy to me.
You were basically right on the money. So, for those of you who are listening...
Got those long pointed fingers.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for those of you who are listening to this, what I am showing you is a picture of Seymour. And his name is literally spelled how you think Seymour would be spelled. He has, for some reason, a very Earth-like name compared to everybody else. He is a man who, first off, has the most rockin' tats on his pecs. Like a long flowing robe with like an open shirt. Long spindly fingers and hair that seems impossible.
Yeah, I would call that impossible. That shouldn't be.
Yeah, it's like he has long blue hair with like bat wing style hair coming out of the sides. His full name is Seymour Guado. His last name is Guado because he is a member of the race of species called the Guado. He is specifically half human and half Guado. And when he is introduced, first off, he constantly has this like incredibly smug look. He looks Yuna directly in the eyes and like makes bedroom eyes before walking off. And they do not make any attempt to hide that this man is a villain.
Yeah.
They were just like straight up like, hey, okay, listen, we're going to let you know what this guy's deal is right away. So he's a maester of the Yevon religion. There are 4 maesters in general, with Maester Micah kind of being over them. And he is the maester of the Guado, taking over for his father, Jiskel Guado. And another nod to the fact that Seymour is probably a bad guy, they almost immediately talk about how Jiskel died under mysterious circumstances and how it was really sad. But it's really great that Seymour, the first half-human, half-Guado, is able to step forward and be the maester for the Guado and help lead them towards the path of Yevon. Because the Guado used to not be like followed like the Yevon religion. It's only very recent that they started this. And they're like, man, it's really great. Real sad that Jiskel died. Kind of strange. He was healthy, but, you know, whatever, man. His son's here. He's really great. So, like, Tidus, like, also immediately, like, susses out that this guy seems like there's something up with him. But he's like, whatever. We got to go play Blitzball. So they go down to the Blitzball Stadium to play, and that's when Yuna's like, hey, I just heard that Sir Auron is somewhere in the city. And it turns out Auron was one of Brass's guardians as well. And so Tidus is like, I have a score to settle with this guy. He threw me into a whale. And so he follows Yuna to go find him. And unfortunately, during this time, there's a scuffle, and Yuna ends up getting kidnapped by the Albed. They end up turning up and like kidnapping her and whatnot. And we learned that apparently the Albed have been doing this to summoners for quite a while now. So Tidus has to kind of abandon the Blitzball game, and he goes and manages to successfully rescue Yuna. And is actually able to rejoin the game in time to help maybe help the Besaid Aurochs. Actually, it's actually canon. Help the Besaid Aurochs win the Blitzball tournament. Which, you know, good for them. They hadn't won once in 10 years since literally Waka was 13. And now they have. Congratulations. Waka can retire on top. So during this time, the Blitzball Stadium is also attacked, and this really is just so Seymour can show up and just be like, don't worry, I got this. Because like a bunch of fiends like just invade the temple, and nobody knows where they came from. Or not the temple, the Blitzball Stadium. It's a temple for Blitzball players.
Yes.
And it turns out he's also a summoner. He's able to summon this giant mummified, like, hell bat-looking creature, and is able to destroy things by just looking at it. And it's incredibly impressive, and everyone's like, man, that's Seymour. He seems real badass. I'm glad he's on our team. I'm glad we're both Party Yevon.
Yep, sure am glad that his bleeding eye laser summon monster coffin creature is on our side.
Yep, that's definitely not going to have to fight this guy later.
Nope.
And it really might seem like we're kind of giving a few things away here, but no, really right from the start, they're like, this is a bad guy. Like, even the musical stings are like, they are coded bad guy.
Yeah.
Once again, Final Fantasy X is not subtle. So everything gets solved, and Tidus, like, runs into Auron and is like, do you know what you did to me? I have been completely lost. I've been attacked by doom whales. I saw a village get massacred. I don't know what's going on. And Auron, one thing about Auron's character is that he gives no Fs at all.
No.
He's clearly a guy who knows more than anyone else, and like he's just not willing to divulge that information. You could see that back in Xanarkhan when he clearly knew what Sin's deal was. And he clearly is letting Tidus know this as well. Although he does let Tidus know one thing. He tells him that he's going to go and offer himself to Yuna as a guardian. And 2, he thinks Tidus should go along. And Tidus at first is like, why? I mean, yeah, I want to fight Sin, but why would I do that? Why would I follow anything you're going to say? He's like, hey, did I ever tell you about your dad? And he lays this bombshell down that makes no sense. But apparently, Sin is Jecht. Which, given that Sin is 1,000 years old, would make no sense. But Auron is very, very certain of this, that Sin and Jecht are one and the same. And, of course, Tidus is completely taken aback by this. And so he's like, anyways, we should go and see Yuna. And he also tells him, hey, listen, don't tell Yuna this, because she's going to believe you. Nobody else will, but Yuna's going to believe you. And so he makes Tidus promise not to say anything. And so he ends up going back to Yuna, offers himself up a guardian, also says, hey, if you want my services, a legendary guardian that's literally revered by everybody, you also got to bring along this idiot. And so everyone's like, yeah, no, cool. Tidus he's a bro. He helped me win a blitzball game. Yeah, sure. So we now basically have the entire gang together. Now we're all going to be on our pilgrimage to get all the Aeons and defeat Sin. And Tidus is like super on board with this. And, he's saying things like, man, I can't wait to do this. And we can all have this like giant party and it's going to be great. And like everybody's like, yeah, no, that's going to be great when we do this. Yeah, we're going to have a giant party. That's going to be fantastic. It's like, man, I can't wait to like come back here to Luca and you can all see me play blitzball. And they're like, yeah, it's going to be great. That's going to be great. And Tidus is like a little lost about this, but he's like, oh, well, yeah, we got a serious mission ahead of us. Let's barrel on forward. And he's like super hyped. And so they start going to the various temples and whatnot, and I won't detail every temple they go to, but I'll say that Yuna learns how to summon a thunder horse, a very cold lady, and a buff dragon. So just know that she learns the abilities to do that.
Yep.
During that time, though, a few things do happen. The first is that we see that during this time, people like members of Yevon, these members of these warrior monks called the Crusaders, are capturing monsters and are taking them to this beach. And everyone's a little surprised about that. Like, why are they just capturing these beasts instead of just destroying them? And they eventually get to these beaches called the Jose Highlands, and they end up actually running into Seymour again. And Seymour is like, oh, Lady Yuna, how are you doing? Oh, it's so good to see you. Oh, I see your path is blocked. Don't worry. Come with me. I'll make sure you can get through. We're about to do this really big operation, you see. We're going to defeat Sin. So it turns out the Crusaders have teamed up with the Al Bhed and have this crazy idea that they are going to use a bunch of monsters to lure Sin to this beach. And they're going to attack him with a ton of Machina. And two maesters are going to overlook this operation. Maester Seymour. And another maester is not really important, but his name is Keenock. He's a dude who's going to die later. Don't worry about him.
Yeah.
And we learned a few things. First off, the Crusaders are a bunch of warrior monks who basically keep the roads safe. They run around and defeat fiends, but they're also kind of on the fringes of Yevon society a bit. They sometimes use Machina weapons and at times are just kind of bend the rules a little bit of Yevon, so they're sometimes looked down upon by the higher-ups in Yevon. And they're especially looked down now because they're teaming up the Al Bhed to fight Sin. To the point, and because of that, the entire Crusaders have actually been excommunicated from the Yevon religion at this point. Now, this might seem a little weird considering that two maesters are overseeing this entire operation, but, it's fine, it's fine. They're just looking at it. They're not actually using the Machina, so they're cool. So Auron immediately susses out that this is not going to work, and he's like, they're just doing this so they can get all these Crusaders killed and all these Al Bhed killed. And It turns out that's completely correct, because Sin shows up and absolutely wipes everybody out. Which, of course, absolutely pisses off Tidus. And, he's like, why are you doing this, Dad? You should be in control. You shouldn't be doing this. And, he, chases after him, tries to, fight him, but obviously Sin is basically a giant doom whale, and so he just literally just swims off. And so Auron speculates two things. He speculates that Tidus, Jecht was just trying to show him that, hey, this is how powerful he is, and this is why he needs to be stopped. And he also speculates to Maester Keenock, so you just put on this operation so you can get all these non-believers killed and get everybody to make sure that they are following the Yevon religion, aren't you? Which Keenock basically says, yeah, more or less. Like, he tried to be subtle about it, but once again, subtlety is not a strong point in this game. He's like, well, maybe things will work out that way. I don't know. And it's like, just say yes. Just be honest.
Yeah.
So we see from the start here some duplicity from the Yevon religion. It's clear that they're willing to use Machina in certain ways, whether it's to get their enemies killed or also to help entertain people as well. Like, the Blitzball Stadium is, you use Blitzball by using Machina. And, like, the city of Luca, which is very big, to the point that you figure Sin would actually attack it, like, has, like, construction crane, like, dock cranes and whatnot. Like, it actually uses Machina. And,
right.
like, Tidus actually points it out to everybody. It's like, hey, so Machina's bad, right? And they're like, yeah, if we get rid of all Machina, Sin will go away. And then Tidus is like, but Yevon allows the use of Machina, right? And they're like, well, Yevon tells us what Machina we're allowed to use. And it's like, you're not applying a whole lot of critical thinking to this, are you?
Yeah.
And it's clear, though, that, like, Yevon's grip does, like, occasionally slip because, like, we're talking about 1,000 years of continuously a doom whale murdering people wholesale to the point that only small communities can really exist. So, like, naturally people are going to be like, well, maybe we should do what the Albed are doing, use Machina. Like, what are we doing? And so Yevon clearly is doing these sort of things in order to make people go like, oh, no, they don't work. Of course we're going to follow the Yevon religion. It's the only way. They'll keep us safe. So Seymour is like, well, that was kind of a failure. Oh, well. And, like, but, we at least tried to use that Machina. We definitely tried. I'm a good guy. And, like, the entire party, like, I even asked, like, Seymour is like, well, isn't it wrong to use this Machina in the first place? He's like, well, sometimes the ends justify the means, right? You're like, but our religion's against that. And he's like, well, pretend you didn't see it. Like, is literally his line. And everyone's, like, kind of taken aback by that.
Right.
They are further taken aback when Seymour just, like, walks up to Yuna and is like, hey, I really hope that one day I be your Lord Zaon to your Lady Yunalesca. Which, Lady Yunalesca is a high summoner, one of the first high summoners, if not the first. And her husband was Lord Zaon, so the implication is obvious. And so everyone's, like, taken aback by that because it's like, oh, okay, so first off, there's a maester here using Machina, and then two, he just kind of proposed to this woman we consider a little sister, and he has literally talked to for 5 minutes? Alright, cool, I guess. So, they end up making their way to the home of the Guado right after this. Oh, go ahead.
One other thing I'll throw out about that operation, it was an abject failure. However, a detail to remember for later is that Sin projects basically a barrier around himself. So things like cannons and whatever else you might fire at him or try to get to him basically doesn't even reach him.
Yeah.
The operation included this giant, crazy electro machina turret thing.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Which was able to successfully break Sin's barrier. It was destroyed in the process, but it did do that much. So that happened. That was interesting.
Yeah, so it is possible to create machina that are strong enough, and you can technically harm Sin. But yeah, that is a good point. That is actually something that will come up later. So they end up making their way to the home of the Guado, which is called Guado Salam. And once they get there, Seymour's like, hey, oh, great, you're here. Come to my mansion. I have a proposal for Yuna.
Gee, I wonder.
And so they end up going to this mansion, and, like, Seymour basically lays it on very thick. First, they go to this, like, Machina room that he has that shows everybody a projection of Xanarkin, how it was 1,000 years ago. And we see that the Xanarkin 1,000 years ago definitely was Tidus' Xanarkin. Like, it looks exactly the same, including every building having an inexplicable waterfall.
Yeah.
And he's like, also, here's this video of Lady Yunalesca and Lord Zaon. Isn't that romantic? Anyways, Yuna, you should marry me. And Yuna, of course, is like completely taken aback by this, and she's like, "Hey, I gotta go talk to my dad first." Which Tidus is naturally confused by this. He's like, "Wait, talk to your dad? I don't quite understand." It turns out that's actually something you can do because conveniently in Guadalsalam, heaven is just right next door. And by that, I literally mean that the place where all the souls go, the far plane, is literally up this staircase that's in, like, right next to Seymour's mansion.
Yes.
Yeah. And so they... what's up?
Quick question. Have we met someone by now?
Oh, Riku? Yeah, we've met her again.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. We'll talk about her in a second. Okay. But... in fact, let's talk about Riku right now. So during their travels, they end up running into Riku again. Like, the Albed try to kidnap Yuna once again and absolutely fail. And it turns out that Riku was actually behind everything. And, like, Tidus runs into Riku and is, like, super excited to see her again. And, like... So, to describe the Albed a little bit, they're all blonde, and they all have green eyes with a swirl pupil. And this is very relevant because it makes Albed very easy to stand out. So, when the entire team shows up, you figure that Waka, who is quite racist against the Albed, would notice this, but he doesn't.
He does not.
Now, Yuna actually recognizes Riku and is like, "Oh, Riku, hey, how's it going? Hey, is it cool if Riku becomes my guardian?" Which seems kind of out of place considering Riku just tried to kidnap you, but everyone agrees to this because, like, "Oh man, Yuna and Riku know each other? That's great." And Waka's like, "Oh man, a friend of Riku's is a friend of mine. Your pupils look weird. Kind of odd. Also, you have blonde hair like Albed. Well, it's probably nothing." So yeah, it's actually good that we do bring up Riku because, yeah, Riku's with everybody at Guadalsalam. And so they go up to the far plane, and it's explained to us that the far plane is a place where the Fireflies can come together and form your dead relatives, and you can speak to them. Now, they don't talk back, which leads to some speculation that, okay, are you actually talking to your dead relatives, or is it just a memory that's being projected back to you? So, like, Riku, for instance, doesn't go to the far plane because she's like, "No, it's just smoke and mirrors. It's complete bullshit." Everyone else goes up there, though, and, Yuna sees her father, Braska, Waka sees his dead brother, Chapu, and, like, even, like, Tita sees his mom as well. So, like, it seems real to him and whatnot. And so, like, Yuna gets her answer and, walks out. And this is where things get a little bit muddy because then all of a sudden one of the spirits actually escapes the far plane. Oh, and yeah. It turns out it's Seymour's dad, Lord Jiskel. So this freaks out all the Guado, and Yuna immediately performs ascending and, makes him go back to the far plane. But during this time, he drops a sphere, which is basically just like a recording. And it, like, he like somehow like whispers to her, is like, "Hey, you should basically watch this later." And so she she takes the sphere and she goes to go back to give Seymour her answer, which the answer is, it turns out she's going to marry Seymour. But Seymour's already, like, moved on to another temple, like, and so they end up having to, like, follow Seymour to one of the temples, which is convenient because they have to go there anyways. And of course, during this time, like, everybody's kind of shocked, like, "Hey, you don't have to marry this dude you've known for 10 minutes and very clearly seems evil." And she's like, no, it'll be my decision. And, like, they said I could still go on my pilgrimage, so everything will be fine. If this helps bring people together, because, like, one of the main things Seymour's trying to sell her on is, like, hey, if a Guado and a human, of two high-ranking families get together, will bring peace to Spira. And it's like, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of strife between our families, but okay, sure, or our races, but why not? Makes sense to me. So during this time, she actually views the sphere, and she's, like, horrified by what's on it. But, like, she's still pretty adamant about marrying Seymour. So they end up, like, making their way to this temple called, at this place called Lake Macalania. And the Al Bhed show up again and try to kidnap you once again. They completely fail. But Al Bhed reinforcements are about to show up and try again when Riku wards them off by speaking in Al Bhed to them. And this is where Waka puts 2 and 2 together. He's like, wait, you're dirty Al Bhed.
To which everyone else goes,
Yeah. Yeah, everyone else already knows. And like he's like upset. He's like, you all already knew? And you didn't tell us? You didn't tell me? Why didn't you tell me? And you're like, well, because you're kind of racist, dude. Like, you're hilariously racist. And so they end up getting into like a really bad college-level religious argument as well, where it's like, where Waka's like, oh, you Al Bhed used Machina, you're the reason sins here. And, you know, Riku's like, well, how can you prove that? How can you prove that that's what caused it? It's like, well, how can you prove that isn't how that was caused? Like, literally, it's an argument I've heard about Christianity and just the concept of religion, like, so many times in college. And it's one of those things where it's like, I hate this conversation because it's so real.
Yeah, it's basically Riku just spending 5 minutes going, how do you know any of the things you're saying to me? And Waka going, shut up.
My religion. It's been around for 1,000 years. And so, yeah, like, yeah, so needless to say, Waka is completely put out by this. So we end up going back to the temple, and they run in right before they're about to run to Seymour. Tidus looks at the sphere and finds out that it is a message from Lord Jiskel saying that, hey, Seymour's not what he seems like. He's evil. He murdered me. He's a bad guy. Which, big shock. Mic drop moment.
Right.
And so they go to confront Seymour. And Seymour just straight up is like, they're like, hey, you murdered your dad. Is that true? And he's like, yeah, what of it? Which everyone's like, wow, you're not going to even... All right, yeah, well, guess what? You can't marry Yuna. And Seymour's like, oh, Yuna, well, you already know about the truth, but you've already agreed, haven't you? And Yuna's like, well, I did at first, but no, actually, I kind of want to stop you now. And so he's like, well, that's a pity. Guess I gotta murder y'all. Unfortunately, in what was going to be a running theme, Seymour doesn't take well being stabbed. And he fights the team and immediately dies.
Yeah.
It doesn't go well for him. So his dead body's on the floor, and Yuna's about to perform the sending when Seymour's bodyguards and like council comes in. It's like, and they're Guado, and they're like, "What have you done? You've killed Lord Seymour." And like, hey, listen, just real quick, what happened here was that like he murdered his dad. And they're like, "We don't care. We're taking him away." And they take the body away before Yuna can send him. This is going to have implications. So yeah, they're like, well, that's unfortunate. Well, I guess we're now, we've now committed crimes. Because they're like, we're going to let the church know about this. And so like, everyone's like, well, can we even continue on for a pilgrimage? And like, Yuna's like, well, I really want to. And Oren's like, yeah, no, of course we can continue on for our pilgrimage. What are they going to do, stop us? Which is like, well, yeah, they probably are going to try, Oren, but okay. Okay, Oren's big thing is he wants Yuna to complete her pilgrimage as soon as possible with zero interruption. Like, literally anytime anybody comes up, it's like, hey, Lady Yuna, can you help us with this? He's like, nope, no, she can't. Go away. Hand to face, push out of the way. Like, he has an agenda of, like, you need to complete this pilgrimage. It's very important. So they're like, okay, well, what should we do? Well, before they can decide that, Sin ends up actually attacking the temple and sinks everybody to the bottom of the lake, which, once again, you think would drown everybody, and yet somehow it doesn't?
Yeah, turns out to be fine.
Yeah, it turns out they're fine. So, like, it is very convenient for them because they are about to be attacked by a bunch of Guado and a bunch of, Yevon priests and whatnot. So the fact that this happens is actually incredibly, incredibly convenient for them. So the gang ends up going like, okay, well, you know what? We need to end up doing this. We need to finish this because it's very important that we defeat Sin. Waka is naturally very troubled by the entire thing because he's now a traitor to his religion, but he's also devoted to Yuna. So he's like, all right, let's go ahead and do this. And they make the decisions like, well, I bet you if we go to Bevel, which is basically the head of the main city, the Rome of the Yevon religion, we can just talk to Maester Micah, we can tell them about Seymour's crimes, and everything will be fine. So like, okay, great idea. Let's go ahead and do this. But once again, the whole problem with being attacked by Sin and sink into the bottom of the lake is that it turns out they're actually on top of Sin right now. And so Sin immediately like knocks them out, and they end up washing up on the beaches of Bikanel Island. If that seems like a really awkward transition, it is in the game as well. It literally is like they make this decision and they go, okay, well, how do we get out of this lake? Oh no, we're on top of Sin. And also this continues Tidus's main mode of transportation of getting traumatically knocked out and ending up on a beach somewhere. So, turns out Bikanel Island is actually very convenient because that's the home of the Al Bhed. The Al Bhed have a home there that's called Home. We're going to learn in Final Fantasy X too, they're real good with names. They're just...
Yeah.
And, like, Waka, of course, is incredibly angry. He's like, I have to be around all these dirty Al Bhed. You weird green-eyed freaks. And Riku's like, hey, listen, I'm okay with taking you to our home that's literally named Home, but you can't make a fuss, and you also can't tell anybody where we're at because the entire religion wants to kill us. And so, Waka agrees with this, and they all end up going to Home. And so we find out a couple things. We find out, one, Yuna's not with them. It turns out Yuna ended up being captured by the Al Bhed and taken to Home. And two, we also find out that Riku's dad, whose name is Sid, is the head of the Al Bhed. We also find out a bit about Yuna's parentage. So Yuna is half Al Bhed and is actually related to Riku. They are both first cousins. Sid's sister married Braska, and they ended up having a kid that was Yuna. And so it turns out that's how like Riku and Yuna know each other. And it also means that Yuna is half Al Bhed, which makes Waka's racism seem all the more poorly thought out. Mm-hmm. It should also be pointed out that Yuna has like one green eye as well and one blue eye, so it's also another thing where it's like, boy, Waka, if you knew anything about the Al Bhed, besides they use Machina, you might have had a different outlook on things. So they end up getting to Home, but by the time they get there, they find out that Yevon has invaded the island and has attacked it with fiends and the Guado. Because they found out that Yuna's there and they want to capture Yuna. Because once again, Seymour... Well, we find out that Seymour's alive and he really wants to marry Yuna. He's okay with being stabbed. Also, Seymour's alive! So they get there and like they have to fight through all the fiends and whatnot, and like Waka's like seeing all the Al Bhed die and whatnot, and he's like, man, okay, yeah, Al Bhed, I guess y'all are actually all right. You're people just like us. And him and Riku hug, and they're like, this is a very sad situation, and Waka's racism is now solved forever.
Yep.
So this also means we're not going to talk about Waka a whole lot anymore. So bye, Waka. Thank you for being a good point of view character as like a religious fundamentalist. You served your purpose well until you didn't.
Yep.
So we find out that the Guado have already grabbed Yuna and have already made their way out. We run into Sid proper. He, for some reason, has a southern accent. Like a Yosemite Sam, actually, more like a southwestern accent is probably more accurate. And he has this really great idea. He's going to blow up Home. He's going to take all these Yevon bastards with him. And by with him, I mean he's going to be on an airship And they're all gonna die. So they all manage to escape and whatnot, but right before they do, they run into a bunch of summoners that ended up being captured, to help free them and whatnot. And this is where we find out another big twist. So, during the game, Tidus has been making these grand pronunciations like, oh man, after we get done defeating Sin, we should come back to this awesome bar and have some drinks and buy unit shots, it'll be great. And everyone will get kind of look down their feet and be like, yeah, that sounds great, Tidus. Ooh. So we find out what happens when the final summoning happens. It turns out the final summoning is such a strain on the summoner that the only way to use it is to expend all your energy, and once you do, you die. So Tidus finds this out and is like, oh, shit. Because he realizes all this time he's been like, man, Yuna, I can't wait for you to use the final summon, and then we're going to go and we're going to get smoothies. And she's like,
Tidus, once again, not good at context clues.
He is awful at context clues. And he asked everyone, hey, why didn't you tell me this? It's like, well, I mean, we wanted to, but who wants to be like, hey, Tidus, Yuna's gonna die. We're sending her to her death. We know that she's like a sister to us, but, this is the only way to stop Sin. And if killing Sin gives some people some respite and some hope, maybe it's worth it, And so Tidus is having a crisis now, but they have to escape home. They get on the airship. They fly away. Sid literally nukes home. And so they fly off. And so Tidus immediately is like, all right. He conspires with Riku and is like, there is absolutely no way we can let Yuna kill herself. We have to find a way to defeat Sin another way. And so him and Riku are totally on board with this. And so they end up talking to Sid and the rest of the team. Like, okay, well, the first things we need to do is we need to go and rescue Yuna. Where is she? Turns out she's back in Bevelle, and they're already getting married. They're already having the ceremony and everything. And so Tidus is like, all right, well, how can we stop this? And he's like, what if we just fly in their full frontal assault and we just jump down there and fight them? Sid immediately calls this a stupid plan and then agrees to do it. He laughs, is like, it's really dumb, but it's the only plan we got. And it's like, y'all have fantasy nuke. Okay. So they fly to Bevelle, and once again, all the maesters are there in the ceremony. Seymour's looking spiffy, Yuna's in a wedding dress. Seymour's looking very much alive. And yeah, the airship basically gets shot out of the sky, but not before the entire team can literally skate down on chains onto basically the Sky Vatican and then immediately start fighting their way up to Seymour. We see that all the Yevon guards are using Machina weapons and are just full veneer off, hey, no, listen, we are definitely going to use Machina when we have to. They literally have Machina artillery and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very successful fighting off through these guards that have literal flamethrowers until they get up to Seymour, and then they realize they have their plan has a slight flaw. Their enemies have guns. And they fight their way to a point where they get surrounded. And they're like, oh, well, oops. So Yuna's Seymour kisses Yuna, and Yuna absolutely hates this. Tidus is absolutely pissed. And Seymour's like, if you marry me, I will spare their lives. So Yuna agrees to this, and Seymour's like, excellent. Kill them! And then so Yuna has the idea of well, okay, if you do that, I'll just jump off this cliff. I'll jump off the Sky Vatican. How does that work? Which they're like, ha, you won't do that. And then she proceeds to do so. Thankfully for her, though, she's able to summon a giant flying beast, and she's perfectly fine. Everyone's distracted by that, so they all just run away. And they end up running and escaping the guards, and they run to the Chamber of the Faith that's at Bevelle. And so this is where Yuna learns buff dragon summon. And we also see that the Chamber of the Faith itself, like, this is the first time we actually go in there as Tidus, and we can see that it's like basically a giant statue that's like living. And like a little boy, ghost boy, pops out of it and like talks to both Tidus and Yuna, saying that, yes, if you could find a way, please, stop our suffering. We've been dreaming for a long time. Please find a way to defeat sin. Which obviously confuses everybody. You're like, boy, y'all seem like you're in a lot of pain here. And so like this kind of gives them like a little bit of food for thought. It's like, well, maybe we should figure out kind of like something else to do here. So they leave the Chamber of the Faith, and unfortunately the problem with like running into the center of Bavel is that that's where all your enemies are. So the second they leave, they get arrested. And they're immediately put on trial, and this is where they're able to plead their case towards Maester Micah. And so Micah's there, all the other maesters are there, Seymour's there as well. And so this is where Yuna's like, hey, listen, I'm letting you know, we have the sphere. Lord Jiskel was murdered by his son, Seymour. He's also an unsent. He's actually supposed to be dead because we killed him, and we need to perform the summoning. The sending. And so we find out what an unsent is. It turns out if you die, but you really don't want to, you have a really strong will, you can just keep living. Just no problems. Which, sure, why not? Why not? That makes perfect sense. And so, like, but this is an unnatural state of affairs. And so, like, Seymour, like, they ask Seymour, it's like, hey, yeah, did you kill your dad? And Seymour's like, yeah, I did. And they're like, oh, okay, cool. And everyone's like surprised, like, no, did you hear him? He just said he killed his dad. And it's like, well, what of it? What are you gonna do? You're gonna, Yevon sometimes does things that Yevon has to do to keep power. And so everyone's like taken aback by this, and they're like, well, we still need to send him. And Micah's like, well, if you do that, you'll have to send me, because it turns out he's an unsent as well. And so everyone's like, well, we darn goofed this one up. And it turns out our religion's kind of a sham. Because they're like, well, maybe we could figure out another way to defeat sin. We're like, there's no other way to defeat sin. We just kind of have to do it this way. Sorry. And so, like, well, this sucks. Oh, one last point to make here is they actually do talk a little bit about the nature of sin and the calm. So every time sin is defeated, a calm happens, where sin kind of just goes away. Don't know where he goes. He just goes away. There have been 4 different calms, and each calm has been getting progressively shorter. The first calm was like 400 years. The second one was like 100 years. The third was like 10 years. But the most recent calm, which was 10 years ago, only lasted 3 months. So that's another reason why people are like, maybe we need to figure out another way to defeat sin, because it seems like there's diminishing returns here. But like the Maesters are pretty insistent, it's like, no, this has to happen this way. It has to happen. A summoner has to be sacrificed because it's the only way people can have hope. And with that, though, they know all the secrets of Yevon, so they're like, well, sorry, I guess we're going to have to execute y'all. Unfortunately, they have a really bad plan for execution, which is they're going to throw him into a giant pit of water that you can swim out of. They even literally say, it's like, oh, well, if they end up swimming out of this, we might as well put guards at the exit so we can stop them. And Seymour volunteers to go do that. So, naturally, they all jump into water and are like, well, I guess we'll just leave. And they do. They literally just, like, swim out and leave. Like, they fight some fiends along the way, but it's... Yevon does not have its shit together at all. Like, when they want to stop a problem, they're very bad at it.
Well, I feel like they're not really used to executing guardians. They're probably more used to executing, I don't know, just people.
Yeah, true. Just like kind of like random people and whatnot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, most people, you throw a Fiend Wolf at them, that Fiend Wolf will do the job.
True. Yeah, and it's one of those things where it's like, giant pit that's full of water that has fiends in it, it probably will be enough.
It'll probably be all right. Oh, that woman has lightning. Well,
Oh, yeah. Oh, jeez. Oh, that's the literal star player of these Xanarch and Abes down there.
oh,
Oh, that's a legendary guardian. Didn't think this one through. Or perhaps he did, because when he do exit, they end up running into Seymour again. And it turns out that Seymour has decided to just straight up murder one of the maesters.
yeah.
Yeah, Maester Keenock, may his memory live long. He's immediately murdered. And this is where we get to learn a little bit about what his deal is. Because one thing that's not really clear here is that he wants to marry Yuna, but he also wants Yuna to continue her pilgrimage. And we're not really sure why. Like, it doesn't really make sense. It's not really like a strong, like, villain goal. So, Seymour's big thing is that he's obsessed with death. Like, even more so than the entirety of Spirit already is. Like, death, like, kind of plays a big part in this story, and, like, in, like, the general culture of Spira, where, like, literally you could die by doom whale or weird, like, you know, wolf beast at any point. Seymour believes that everybody is suffering, but if everybody dies, then all suffering will end. Which, not wrong, but it seems like that really wouldn't work out. Like, it seems like all the people who would die would have a problem with that.
Yeah, you would think.
So his big plan is like, Yuna will kill Sin, and then I will become Sin. And then I can kill everybody, because I will control Sin. Which everyone's like, first off, I don't know how you plan on doing that. Doesn't seem like you should be able to. And two, you are crazy. So he decides, he goes like, oh, well, you foolish people. Well, I will show you. I'll kill you right here if you're not going to help me with my plan. He proceeds to get stabbed and die.
Yeah.
So, once again, though, they aren't able to form the sending because they have to immediately leave Bevelle. So, Seymour so far, 0-2. 0-2. So the gang retreats to this forest called the Macalania Woods. And, Tidus and Yuna end up kind of like hanging out by themselves, and they kind of have like a heart-to-heart. Yuna's like, maybe I should just give up on the pilgrimage. Like, why bother? Like, my religion's like a complete scam. There's no real guarantee that the calm's going to last more than a couple months. Like, this seems like a really bad idea. And Tidus is like, yeah, you totally should. I think this would be a great idea. And she's like, yeah, you can take me. You're Xanarkin? It's like, yeah, you'll love it, man. City never sleeps. It's great. They got movie theaters. But, like, Yuna's like, kind of bummed about it. She starts crying. She's like, because one, she kind of knows that they can't get back to that Xanarkand, because as we learn, Jecht's big thing is that he wanted to get back to Xanarkand, but he eventually learned that he sort of couldn't, and so he teamed up with Vraska to go and defeat Sin and whatnot. So she already kind of knows that this is all just kind of a childish dream, and so like they comfort each other and they kiss. They're officially in love. They're officially an item. It's great. It's very, very romantic. And I kind of mean that, actually. I'm being a little facetious, but, it actually is a really good scene.
It is a good scene.
Yeah. Once again, Final Fantasy X story is it's very good. So she ultimately decides that they're going to continue the pilgrimage, which Auron's like, great, I'm down with that. Everyone else is a little skeptical, like, hey, you can quit at any time. But she's like, no, I think this is important. And Tidus is like, and I'm going to find a way to defeat Sin without Yuna killing herself. And everyone's like, no, you're not. But okay, good on you. So they've already completed the pilgrimage at this point. Now they only have to go to Xanarkand and learn the final summon. To get there, they have to go through this giant mountain called Mount Gagazet, which is the home of the Ronzos. So they get there, and the Ronzos let Yuna pass after she makes a profound speech about how she just really wants to stop Sin. And they make their way up the mountain. Unfortunately, when they get to the top of the mountain, they run into Seymour again. Who just can't take a hint. Seymour's like, Yuna, you should allow me to be your Lord Zeon. Also, by the way, Kamari, I just genocided all of your race off screen. He literally says this. He literally says, "Oh yes, the Ronzo threw themselves at me, and I just killed them one by one until there were no more." And so Kimari is incredibly pissed about this, as you can imagine. And everyone else is just like aghast at this and like, how could you possibly do this? And he mentions out loud, he's like, yes, I know I can become Sin because Lord Jecht became Sin. Which everyone obviously did not know this up to this point. And they're like, I'm sorry, what was that? And he's like, well, time to kill you all. And then he fails and dies.
Yep.
0-3. This time he does seem to like actually like fade away this time though. So it seems like he's gone for good. And it's like everyone's like, all right, great. Don't have to deal with him anymore. Fantastic. But everyone then also immediately turns to Tidus and is like, so what's this about your dad being Sin? And Tidus is like, yeah, I don't really quite understand that either, but apparently he is. And they're like, well, when were you going to tell us that? And like, I don't think he actually says this, but I know it was definitely in my mind. He's like, well, when were you going to tell Tidus that you're all on a death pilgrimage? Like, don't feel like this works. And Tidus is like, just don't worry about it. We're right next to Xanarkin. We just need to keep going. So they get to the very tippy top of Mount Gagazet, and they come to this wall that is just full of frozen bodies. And we find out this is a giant faith. Once again, faiths are just like living statues and whatnot. And so Tidus like goes up to it and like touches it and is like, man, this is kind of crazy. And then passes out and wakes up back in Xanarkand. So there he meets like this ghostly child who's been popping up a couple times throughout the game, just in ways that are just being kind of uselessly cryptic. And we kind of find out more or less the truth behind everything. So we learned first off what happened 1,000 years ago. It turns out that Xanarkand and Bavel were involved in this giant war called the Machina War. They both had a bunch of Machina on each side, and they were fighting each other. A big problem was that Bavel had more advanced Machina, whereas Xanarkand had summoners. And unfortunately, summoners don't do well against machine guns, so they were losing the war. So knowing that defeat was upon them, the people of Xanarkand who had survived up to that point traveled up to Mount Gagazet to become a giant faith. And they did that not to create Sin or anything like that, but to create like a perfect dream version of Xanarkand off the coast that could just live forever. So all the people in buildings are just a dream of the faith, just like an Aeon would be. What this means is that Tidus is a dream. He's not actually real. Which is a slight problem. Because the faith really, really wants Sin to finally be defeated so they can just rest. They've been dreaming for 1,000 years in some sort of like weird limbo between life and death, and they just kind of want to pass on. So they make Tidus promise to do this, and Tidus wakes up, and they're like, hey man, what happened there? He's like, I don't know, fell asleep. I dreamed about Yuna. But not in a sexy way, and we should go to Xanarkand. And like Yuna's like, no, something's wrong. Like, what happened? She's like, oh, nothing happened. She's like, you're lying to me, aren't you? And so we have this reverse now. Because like at the start, everybody was kind of lying to Tidus, not letting him in on the truth. But now we, like, because Yuna was on this, death march that was unavoidable. And now we seem to have the opposite going on here. Where now Tidus has this knowledge of like, okay, if I actually accomplish this and find a way to defeat Sin, I will stop existing. All these friends I've made, this girlfriend I now have, they're all going to be completely heartbroken.
Sorry, did they explain or spell out why Sin is keeping the faith from resting? No. Okay.
Not yet. We are getting to that, though.
Okay. Yeah, I can remember if that...
Yeah, the whole Xanarkand Mount Gagazet part is basically just like, okay, we're going to stop with the mysteries now.
Right. It's doing that anime thing I hate where it's like, here's the plot points, we'll tell you why later.
Yeah, this is maybe like one of the big things I don't like about Final Fantasy X's plot. Like, I like it on a whole, but it does decide to reveal every single one of its mysteries within 2 hours.
Yeah.
Which is a big reason also why I was having trouble summing up this game in the first place, because it's like there's a lot of foreshadowing that happens, and then they do all the plot points at once.
Right.
Which is, it's a little unfortunate. Like when you get to this part, it just hits you with a ton of bricks.
Yeah.
So they end up Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I remember playing through this. This moment was very powerful and very sort of shaking. Mm-hmm. But
it
yeah,
really
trying
was.
to remember why is that again? It's... But anyway, go on.
Yeah. Oh, we're going to get into the why in a second. Also, I just have to ask you this, Mason. If you were a dream version of yourself, would you stop a giant doom whale?
Probably not.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like being a dream version of yourself would be kind of rad. I mean, you theoretically... Actually, it's not really clear if you age or not. I think you technically do. You could definitely have...
Yeah.
Yeah, you can definitely have kids. I know that much.
So they're like half dream kids?
No, they're just full kids. They're actually completely regular kids. Yeah, it turns out being a dream version or an unsent or whatever really doesn't confer a whole lot of downsides.
No. So I feel like up to this point, it's sort of been implied that Seymour has become like a more instinctual and unraveled version of himself since his death.
Yeah, his constantly murdering him causes him to be more and more unstable, certainly. Yeah.
But yeah, other than that, it's like,
Yeah, it's just like, well, I died, but not really. Anyways. So yeah, so they travel through Xanark. They get to Xanarkon, and we find out that, Xanarkon is definitely destroyed. We've actually seen a Xanarkon before. The very start of the game, when Tidus was asking us to listen to a story, this was what he was staring at. And we find out that he's been just telling this story up until this final point. And now we're at more or less at the present. So as we travel through Xanarkon, Xanarkon has like a ton of fireflies there, so we keep seeing like memories of the past, and we see young Auron and Jecht and Braska like making their way through Xanarkon. Like Auron's trying to convince Braska not to like sacrifice himself, and Jecht's like kind of coming to terms like that he's never going to go back to Xanarkon, and like his Xanarkon, I should say. And like he's promising, like Auron's like, hey, you need to find my kid. If something happens, find my kid and make sure he's not a crybaby, okay? I wanted to make sure he was going to be a cool blitzball player. I can't say the word love because I'm a manly man, I'm macho, but I care about that idiot, the crybaby idiot who's not as tall as me. And so we see people we see him talk about Auron telling Braska's hey, Sin's probably just gonna come right on back, and Braska's well, what if this time it actually works, right? You can see that they're just really pinning it on this final something and just hoping for the best. So they get to where the final kind of Chamber of the Faith is, and it turns out it's at the Blitzball Stadium from the very beginning of the game. And we get to the actual Faith, and we see that it's broken and dead, and has been for a long time, which throws everybody for a loop. They're I don't understand this. So a mysterious ghost attendant shows up and is oh, hey, how's it going? Listen, Lady Unileska is in the next room. She's going to help you out with that. You're going to get the final summoning there. So everyone's oh, Lady Unileska is still alive? She should be over 1,000 years old at this point. And we learn she's also an unsent, but she's an unsent with a purpose. She's here to teach people how to perform the final summoning. And so we come into basically the main Blitzball lobby. Unileska walks down. I really wish I got a picture for this to show you, Mason, because Unileska's idea of clothing is a piece of paper, essentially, over each breast, and that's about it. Which, to be fair, if I was 1,000-year-old living zombie, I probably wouldn't wear clothes either.
Yeah,
just
you only get visitors every 10 or 15 years or whatever.
And given how often the final summoning actually happens, it's probably even longer than that.
Yeah.
So it's oh, hello. That's right, I am hot. How are you doing? So she comes on down, walks past probably an ancient popcorn machine, and is welcome, everybody. So See, you got all the Aeons? I need you to select one of your guardians to become the final Aeon. And everyone's like, what? She's like, yes, you need to have somebody who has a strong emotional connection so I can turn them into the final Aeon. And everyone's like, oh, what? And she's like, yeah, I'll give you some time. You choose. I'll be right back. And so everyone's taken aback by this. Like, okay, so somebody needs to become a faith in order to become the final summoning. And so that's kind of the big reason why there's guardians and why there's a summoner, why they have this close bond and whatnot, and why they have to have this strong bond. Because you need to have a strong bond to make a strong faith, to make something strong enough to actually defeat sin. So it isn't just that a summoner dies, though. It also means, in many ways, that a guardian has to die as well. So immediately, every guardian that's with you kind of trips over themselves to volunteer. Like, Lulu's like, hey, I'm down. Waka's also like, I'm down. Yuna's like, I'm just not really sure. And we see one more memory. We see Orin just being like, you really don't got to do this, Braska. I know I said this like 10 times, but you really don't have to do this. And Jet's like, shut up. You know what? I will become the faith. I'll become the final summoning. It's fine. I'm not going to get back to Xanarkand. I'm destined to die here. I'm destined to never see my son again. And so Braska thanks Jecht, and that's how Jecht, well, that's for firsthand how Jecht becomes Sin. So Yuna says, you know what? I've made up my mind. I'm going to go through with this, but I got to ask Yunalesca one question. So they walk up to Yunalesca's chamber and ask her, hey, is it possible to actually defeat Sin? And she's like, no, it's not possible. Like, but if we use the final summoning, we defeat Sin, right? She's like, no, you just destroy his shell. You destroy his shell, and then my father, Yu Yevon, ends up taking over the final summoning, and he uses that to build his new shell, his new Sin. So this is how we learn that Jecht becomes Sin. We learn that the final summoning is done, it destroys Sin's shell, and then her father, Yu Yevon, pops out, infects the final summoning, and uses that to create a new Sin. So you're probably wondering, who the hell is Yu Yevon? Great question! It's sort of poorly explained, but Yu Yevon was the leader of Xanarkand, and the father of Yunalesca. So the other half of his big grand plan to save Xanarkand was that everybody was going to go and up to Mount Gagazet and form Dream Xanarkand and dream of it forever. And then in order to protect Xanarkand, he was going to summon a bunch of Pyreflies and create a shell for himself called Sin. Now, this shell was incredibly powerful, and it was programmed to basically do two things. Destroy any large settlement, and destroy anything that goes anywhere near Xanarkand. And then there's sort of a third tertiary thing, which is destroy all Machina, but that sort of just comes part and parcel with, if you're a big settlement, you probably have Machina. So that's the reason why Sin is protecting Dream Xanarkand. Because he wants to make sure nobody gets there, like, finds out about it and tries, like, I don't know, invade it or dispel it or what have you. And it's also why he's kind of, like, Sin's kind of going on autopilot, destroying anything, like, either remotely close to it or remotely big enough that it could discover it. So that's kind of Sin's big deal. And so what happens when, Sin's shell is destroyed is that it needs something else that has, like, a ton of Pyreflies associated with it, and the final summoning has a ton of Pyreflies, which is why it gets infected and becomes the new Sin. We also learned that it's not the final summoning that kills the summoner, but rather it's Yu Yevon infecting the final summoning and then just turning around and killing the summoner is what does it. Because he goes, well, gotta get rid of this loose end.
Right.
So Yunalesca, like, drops this on everybody, and Yuna's like, but then there's no hope. There's no hope if we do this. And then Yunalesca's like, no, there's definitely hope. Like, I created the first final summoning using my husband and managed to defeat Sin. Maybe he'll come back. I mean, he'll come back, but at least for the short period of time he's not there, people will have hope. And this is where we see one final memory of Auron show up, where Auron basically confronts Yunalesca about the exact same thing and tries to attack her, and then Yunalesca just bops him and kills him. And we learn that Auron himself is an unsent right here. Which is also why he knows everything. Like, he's done this all before. He's seen this bullshit before, and even just calls Yunalesca out on it. It's like, yeah, just it's like, she's like, because she says, like, well, you're not sacrificing a summoner in vain. He's like, maybe not in vain, but it is still pointless anyways. And so Yuna kind of thinks about it for a second. Is like, you know, not going to do this. I'm going to find a way to defeat sin in my own way. And Yunalesca's like, all right, well, you can't leave here, so guess I got to kill you. And so she turns into like this giant snake beast, and in a fight that's actually kind of the true final boss in many ways.
Kinda.
Yeah, it's a very tough boss fight. They end up actually defeating Yunalesca and cause her to be sent. And during that time, she's like, you have literally just doomed Spira. I will basically come back to haunt you. You people suck. And so they end up sending her, and they're like, well, what now? We kind of didn't come up with a plan. And so Tidus, though, well, really more Waka and Yuna, and then Tidus just sort of chimes in. It turns out Jecht has, every time they've noticed this, like, sometimes when they walk out of one of the temples, like, Sin will be nearby listening to this hymn that is, like, the official hymn of the Yevon Church. It's called the Hymn of the Faith. And apparently it's, like, Jecht's favorite song. And Sin is always incredibly calm when he hears it. So they figure out, it's like, if we get everybody in the world to sing the hymn at the same time, we can get close enough to Sin that we can basically just blast a hole into him and then walk in. If this seems like a garbage plan, it is.
I forgot about this. I forgot about the song.
Yeah.
Except I didn't. I just, in this moment, I forgot that's where it goes. But yes.
Yeah. So they end up going to, they first end up going to Bavel because they want to share this plan with Maester Micah and be like, hey, listen, we, first off, kind of destroyed the only way you could have a final summon. And two, we have a plan. And he's like, he basically goes, I'm not bothering to listen to that plan. You've removed hope from Spira. I'd rather die than see what happens here. Which he then proceeds to exactly do. He just sends himself.
I forgot completely about that part. I forgot that people can send themselves.
Yep. He's just like, I guess I'll die now. And poof, he's gone. It does lead to this like fun scene where like one of the attendants comes in. It's like, oh, has Maester Micah showed up yet? And Auron's like, yeah, how much longer do we have to wait? And she's like, oh, I'm sorry, I'll go find him. He's like, all right, we need to run now before we notice. So they get back on to the airship with Sid and whatnot, and they're getting ready for their final plan and all that. Like, Tidus confronts Auron about being an unset, and like he's like kind of sad about it, and like Auron's like, oh come on, being an unset has its advantages. He's like, first off, I was able to get the Dreams Anarchin and watch over you, and two, clearly it hasn't really affected me that badly. I got to be cool and somehow self-age myself.
Yeah.
So they end up getting the entire, I forget exactly how they get the entire world to sing the hymn at the same time. I think literally just use like a giant projection from the airship or something similar.
Something like that, yeah.
And this works. It ends up calming Sin down. Now, it doesn't calm him down enough that when they get close, he doesn't try to fight back. But they're able to fight him and blow a hole in him and actually land the airship inside of him. So now they're in there, and they're like, all right, we're in Sin. Okay, let's go there and let's beat my dad. Punch my dad in the face. So they end up like going for quite a while. They have to solve a bunch of puzzles and whatnot. And then guess who's there? It's our boy Seymour.
Oh yeah, that's right.
You're probably wondering how Seymour even got in here. That's a good question. I don't know. Point is that Seymour's here, and now all the pieces are put together. Now you know why he wanted Yuna to go through her pilgrimage, right? She wanted to make him. He wanted to make her to make him the final summoning, so that Yu Yevon could infect him, and then he could become the new Sin, but he would be strong enough to take over, and then he would destroy everything.
Right. As I recall, there was something about Seymour's soul was so powerful that when he was sent, Yu Yevon infected him anyway, and his soul got caught in Sin or something like that.
Huh.
He was basically blocked from being sent to the far plane by Sin.
Checks out. I would believe that. It's either way, it's never well explained.
No, not really.
And, you know, he decides, like, well, first though, I gotta kill all of you, because I'm already here. I don't need you anymore, Yuna.
Right.
It doesn't go well for him. He's 0 for 4, and this time he's actually for realsies officially sent. He's gone. He ain't coming back. So they end up getting to the center of Sin, which turns out is a giant blitzball stadium, and they run into Jecht, who's just kind of chilling out there. He's like, hey son. Hey, Orn. Good to see you both. You made it. Guess you kept your promise. You need to kill me very soon because I'm about to lose myself to Sin. He's like, I can barely hear him anymore, and if you don't do this now, there's going to be no stopping me. And he like implores Tidus to kill him. You know, Tidus and him like share like a pretty emotional moment. Like Tidus tells him like, he's like, you know, listen, Dad, you know I just hate you, right? And he's like, yeah, I know. Anyways, give me a good fight. And then he transforms into a giant, incredibly, like, metal beast version of himself. And that really bad rock song from the start of the game plays again. And it's so good.
Yeah. That's
a
good fight.
It's so good. And so they end up fighting him. And they end up actually beating him and destroying Jecht. And so that's phase 1 of the plan now. Phase 2 of the plan is that they now have to weaken Yu Yevon. Like, Yevon is now going to be looking for something to infect. And so Yuna needs to summon all of her Aeons, have them be infected, and they have to defeat those Aeons. You know, doing this over and over just slowly weakens Yu Yevon more and more, who, by the way, at this point, is just more incorporeal at this point. And, like, when he does take a form, it's the form of a giant tick. Because, once again, this game is not subtle.
No.
So they do this over and over again until there's no Aeons left, and then they just fight Yu Yevon head on and manage to defeat him. And so upon defeating him, Sin immediately starts to fall apart. They run back to the airship and fly away just in time to see Sin explode into like a fireworks show of pyroflies. And this is where, you know, Tidus kind of lays his cards down. He starts to disappear because the Faith now can stop dreaming, and they all immediately die off. All the temples, all the statues just like turn to stone, like the Faith on top of Mount Gagazet turned to stone. And he just slowly starts to phase away. And he just looks up to Yuna and is like, hey, Yuna, I have to go. Everybody is absolutely upset about this. And like Yuna tries to hug Tidus, but she just phases through him. Like Tidus gives like that ghost hug, and he jumps off the airship and basically jumps more or less into heaven, and the last scene you see is him high-fiving his dad, and that's the game. Well, technically there's one extra scene afterwards where Yuna goes, boy, we lost a lot of people, but now we can rebuild. But that is the plot of Final Fantasy X.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just impressed that they managed to pack all of that into a single game.
Right? There's a lot going on. You can see why it took me like an hour and a half to sum that up.
Yeah. It's a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
Did they explain where the Sin in Dream Xanarkand came from?
The Sin in Dream Xanarkand is just Sin. Because Dream Xanarkand is it's a physical-ish place.
But it's the collective dream of the Faith.
Yep. Yeah, they dreamed buildings. And those buildings are real.
But they're like on a different plane.
No.
No?
Nope. Dream Zanarkand literally is just off the coast of Zanarkand.
Oh.
Yeah. Like, you can't really get there because anytime you come close, Sin shows up to make sure you don't. Because that's one of the purposes of Sin, is to make sure that nobody finds this Dream Zanarkand. That's one of the reasons why Yu Yevon creates it in the first place.
Okay, that's something I never caught. I always understood Dream Zanarkand as, like, actually a dream.
Yeah,
and then
like,
Titus just got spat out of it somehow by Dream Sin.
Yeah, and you're not wrong, because it technically is a dream. It's just that dreams can be made real.
Right.
So yeah, it's really, really strange, but yeah, they Sin made not Yu Yevon, but like the people of Zanarkand made their own little Zanarkand that just, I guess, people can just live and have kids and die in, and yeah, Sin just exists to destroy anything large enough that would even dream of going and looking at that.
Right.
And make sure that nobody can get close to it. Like, that's literally his only purpose.
So why did Sin start attacking it?
So that's because Jack was still in control.
Okay.
Yeah. A big reason why Sin is so close to Tidus, like, throughout the start of the game, is because he wants to... Like, Orin speculates it's because he wants to show Tidus what his deal is and spur him to find a way to stop him.
Right. So Jecht basically overrode Sin's programming.
Yeah.
And attacked Zanarkand.
Yeah, which really is, like, does lead some credence to, like, Seymour's plan of, like, I will take over Sin. Like, it seems like it wouldn't be impossible, at least in the short term. But,
right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, that does make more sense. The other thing that always confused me about that was that Sin's form when he attacked Zanarkand was different.
So...
Like, I assumed that was like the Proto-Sin, like its original form before the 4 other incarnations turned him into a whale monster.
So I guess I did actually grab a picture of Sin. Probably good to actually show Mason that. That's what Sin looks like, by the way. Yeah. Yes, that is a city on his back. For those of you who don't know, he's basically just a dream whale with wings.
That is interesting to see. It is not at all what I was imagining.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So Sin has gravity powers.
Yes.
So he gravitated up a ball of water around him. He was using that water to shoot out at Zanarkand.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
for some reason, I assumed the sphere form was smaller.
Perspective in this game is actually, in their cutscenes, is actually kind of bad.
Yeah.
Like, even in the final cutscene, like, Sin is, like, floating over Bavel, and he is either, at times, as large as the city, half the size of the city, or only about as large as the airship.
Yeah.
So I think that's just more developer goof than anything else.
I also don't know why... Well, I guess I do know why they made him into the water sphere. It's because that's easier to render, probably. Yeah. And you never see Sin like this in his full form pre-rendered. You'll see, like, his head and his arms.
Yeah. Yeah, you only see bits and pieces of him, like, throughout until the very, very end.
Yeah.
Like, when you're actually fighting him on the airship. But yeah, this was this game had like an incredible story, in my opinion. Like, a very sad ending, which was kind of surprising. Like, Final Fantasy games aren't unknown to, like, sadder endings, but they usually tend to be, like, more hopeful in general.
Right.
But
well, and I know FF7 had a very, not specifically depressing ending, but a ambiguous ending.
Incredibly ambiguous, yes.
And so I imagine that sort of gave them some empowerment to be like, oh, we don't have to tie this all together nicely. Or you know, be hopeful at the end. We can sort of cut both ways.
Yeah. No, totally. Yeah, so, like, yeah, I absolutely loved the story as a kid. I still do to this day, even if I do think they pack things in at the end a little too heavy.
Yeah. But, so my feeling about specifically its delivery and its execution is it is the first game not directed by the series creator, Hinorobu Sakaguchi.
Yeah.
And it is far from the first Final Fantasy to have a convoluted plot. But I think one of the things Sakaguchi did very well, very consistently, is to tell a convoluted plot in a way that was understandable and compelling, at least as long as you were playing it.
Yeah.
I know after I played FF7 and I stopped to think about it, certain plot holes started to reveal themselves, but in the moment, a lot of it made enough sense to push the game forward.
Yeah.
And I think after Sakaguchi left, that was sort of a hole that Square struggled to fill for a while.
Yeah, I agree. And I think a lot of... Speaking of just, like, convoluted plots, Final Fantasy X, the entire franchise, is going to be real big on that. And I don't want to lay this at the feet of one person, but remember that name I said to put a pin in?
Yeah.
Kazushige Nojima. He's kind of big about being very convoluted, usually intentionally, in his stories. Like he's a really good about like world building. He loves world building,
right?
But that he tends to kind of get into the weeds of that.
Yeah.
And as we talk about Final Fantasy X-2, and then the stuff that comes after Final Fantasy X-2, that's going to rear its ugly head.
Oh boy,
very strongly.
And again, I think Sakaguchi also likes convoluted, but he has a rare gift for doing convoluted well.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So yeah, speaking of that, so the Final Fantasy X portion of this was always going to be the longest. We're definitely not going to be taking nearly as much time with Final Fantasy X-2 and the subsequent novel and radio drama that comes afterwards.
Boy, I can't wait for that.
Indeed. I did want to ask you, how are you all feeling right now? Should we leave that for next week, or...
I think it might make sense to leave that for next week, or next time.
All right, then. We'll go ahead and do that for next time. So next time, on Fallin Thru Plotholes, 1-2, or should I say... Actually, you know what? Yeah, 1-2 would work.
Yeah, or I-2, if you will.
I-2. We're going to be going over the rest of Final Fantasy X, starting with the first video game sequel in Final Fantasy X history. Well, Final Fantasy history with Final Fantasy X-2. And then we're going to go off the deep end, because, boy, do I got a really bad novel to talk to y'all about.
Oh, boy.
Oh, boy, indeed. But thank you all for joining us. And like, how do y'all feel at the end of this? How do y'all?
I feel good. I enjoyed this a lot. I feel somewhat enlightened, because the last time I played this game, I was 15 or 16. So that's some 15, 16 years ago. And so I knew that there were things I'd forgotten or hadn't picked up the first time. I've only played through it once. And so I knew that there were things that I didn't properly pick up on, and this would probably help illuminate, and it certainly did.
Yeah, great. And Mason, how'd you feel?
Feeling a little bit overwhelmed. There's a lot of details to pick up on.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
An interesting story to hear.
Yeah. One of the things I intentionally selected Final Fantasy X in many ways because it has a slightly smaller scope, but it is definitely a difficult thing to summarize, and I kind of want to give myself a little bit of a challenge with that. I assure you, when we talk about something like Mega Man, it's actually going to be a lot easier to digest, because just because you don't have one game that has like everything in it, and then a bunch of things after that, it's a little bit more evenly spread out. But yeah, it's a very convoluted sort of thing. I don't blame you for being a little lost. But yeah, with that, I guess we will see you all next week. I'll suspect probably like a Saturday or a Sunday. We'll figure it out.
Yep.
And in the meantime, thank you all for joining us today.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Take care,
thanks.
everybody. And if you see any dude whales rising out of the ocean, kiss your butt goodbye, I guess, because that whale...
Yeah, I was going to say run, but that doesn't work. So
yeah, no, that ain't going to happen.
Go to sleep.
See you later, dude.